Tractate Bava Basra is the longest tractate in the Talmud, at least in page count. Interestingly, this is more due to the change in commentaries as opposed to the actual word count, but that's going to be discussed more at the beginning of chapter 3. For now, Bava Basra is the final of the 3 subcategory tractates detailing civil and financial law, now particularly discussing points on property law, transactions, and inheritance. Chapter 1 will begin discussion on the laws of shared property. The first Mishnah says, if 2 men are partners in ownership of a courtyard, and they decide to put a partition in the middle, the wall needs to extend into both of their portions. Generally, the construction material follows the local custom. So if people build with rough edge stones, they would use that. If they used smooth stones, that should be used, etc. Particularly if the wall is made using rough edge stones, they both must provide 3 handbreadths of land of their property to build the wall. If they're using smooth plain stones, they need to provide 2.5 handbreadths. If they're using half bricks, they need to provide 2 handbreadths each, and if they're using whole bricks, they need to provide 1.5 handbreadths each. If eventually the wall collapses, the presumption is that the wall was built jointly by the 2 of them, so the area and the stones would be divided between the 2 of them. Similarly, this would apply with a jointly owned garden. If the local custom is to build garden partitions, both can be obligated to build a partition. In a valley of grain, which there isn't really a custom to build partitions within, neither party can be forced to help build a wall. If one side decides they nevertheless want a wall, it needs to be totally on his side, and he needs to make a sign on the wall indicating that it's his. So if this wall collapses, the builder gets to keep the area and the stones as his own. If, however, both parties agree to build the wall together, it needs to be right between the fields, with a sign on both sides of the wall to indicate the joint ownership. So that way, if the wall collapses later on, they'll know that the land and the stones belong to both of them equally. The Gemara spends some time giving definition as to the word used here, mechitza, as meaning a wall, as discussed. This means as the only reason the wall must be built is as the partners agreed to build a wall initially. The implication is that it wasn't strictly necessary in the first place for such a wall to exist. They're only being obligated to build it because they had agreed to initially, which would seemingly mean that visual trespass, looking into somebody's private field, is not considered to be a damage, as the wall was only required once they both agreed to it and not beforehand. Alternatively, however, the word mechitza doesn't need to be defined as wall. It could also be translated as a division, which completely changes the situation, as now it means they agreed to make a division and are being obligated to make specifically a wall, as apparently visual trespass is considered a damage. It qualifies some of the particularities with grammar according to both of these translations. When it said that the wall must be in the center of the courtyard over both their properties, this was to show that if one person consents to the wall, he can't claim he was just consenting to have his view blocked. He's also agreeing to give up a few inches of land that the wall will stand in. Anyways, it begins to debate from a number of different cases as to whether visual trespass is considered to be a damage. It said that there needs to be a wall by a garden, but a garden is unique as the evil eye exists, so it has some unique stringencies. A later case mentions that if a wall collapses, both men are obligated to rebuild it, but again, this is different, as a pre-existing wall has unique laws. So there's a later case which says we make the residents of a courtyard chip in for a gatehouse, but again, that's unique as a visual trespass from the public domain is treated more strictly. It argues yet another case which implies that if there's enough room for both sides to get at least 4 cubits, they can force a division to be made, again implying that visual trespass is considered to be a damage, and this is needed to prevent this. So again, it's answered, it's not referring to a wall, that's specifically talking about a boundary marker. Okay, another later case, it says when building a wall directly opposite somebody's house, the window placement has to be arranged so that way he can't just look into the person's house. So it's explained that visual trespass straight into somebody's house is treated more stringently than into somebody's yard, so again, it's not comparable. One last proof, if somebody's roof is next to his neighbor's courtyard, he needs to put a fence up there so he can't just look into the man's yard. The implication is that visual trespass is an issue. So here the answer is it's a unique case, as the yard owner can claim that the man's roof usage is irregular and he doesn't know when he'll be up there. Other versions of this debate are cited regarding the translation of the word mechitza and if the implication is that visual trespass is considered to be a damage. For instance, if visual trespass was actually considered to be a damage, then regarding the case where the partners agreed to divide their courtyard, seemingly even if they hadn't agreed, they would be obligated to build a wall. So it answers that this courtyard in question was too small to force a wall, and one's only built if they both consent to it. It discusses some variation on this. More particularly, the division is obligatory here, as either they acquired their own sides of the courtyard, making retraction impossible, or it's that they went into the property and acquired their half by making an improvement, hence why retraction is, again, impermissible. Definitions for the various different types of stones are provided. Some say that the implication is that if the wall was made of half bricks, there must be a handbreadth gap in between the two sides of the wall, although there's variation if This is if it's filled with pure or inferior mortar. It's also asked, there were several specified measurements for the width of the wall depending on the used material. Based on some related sources regarding the construction of the temple, it asks if this is the set width or if it varies depending on the height. The structure of the temple in regards to some particular laws is additionally discussed. It's also learned from a source back in Tractate Bava that the listed measurements include the plastering layers. Somewhat unrelated, it mentions that a synagogue cannot be demolished unless there's a new synagogue built to replace it. Some say this is as they might negligently not rebuild one, others say it's out of concern that the community won't have a place to pray, so there's a practical difference if there is a different synagogue located nearby, as then the second issue wouldn't apply. It brings some instances of this principle. Some say a synagogue can just be demolished if it's actively falling apart, which is possibly the reason the temple was allowed to be taken down and renovated by the king Herod, or that was unique as a king is trusted to keep his pledge. Related on Herod, it said that Herod was originally a slave of the Hashmona'i house and wanted to marry a girl from the family, and heard a voice from heaven saying that any slave right now that rebels will succeed. So he killed all of the slave masters and the Hashmona'im family, but spared the girl to marry her. The girl, however, decided to prevent this by going to a roof, announcing that the line of the Hashmona'im kings would end with her, and Herod would remain a slave, and then jumped off, taking her own life. Herod, however, decided to preserve her corpse in honey, possibly in order to marry her and ascend the throne by right, and others say it was just in order to cohabit with her. Anyways, then Herod killed all the sages, besides for one as an advisor, but decided to blind him. Herod once came to this blind sage, pretending to be a commoner, and questioned him at length about the king, but the sage remained loyal and refused to speak ill of Herod, so Herod regretted killing all the other sages and decided to rebuild the temple as recompense. Herod used delaying tactics to try and get permission from the Roman government and built it in the meanwhile, but they forbade it anyways. But the temple was built, and it spends some time describing its beauty, particularly with its stonework. It says it was permitted for the sage to help Herod in this case, either as he was still legally a slave, or as it was in order to rebuild the temple. It mentions some similar points by the prophet Daniel. Anyways, back to property law. It said it goes according to the local custom. This is to include that if the custom is to make a weak wall, like one out of palm fronds, then that's what should be done. It had also stated that if the wall collapsed, the land and stones are equally divided. This is necessary to state to show this applies even if the stones all fall onto one property, or it's to show that it applies even if one partner cleared all the stones into his property, taking them, that they still need to divide it. It also qualifies the remaining teachings, saying that an ordinary garden is considered a place where there's typically a partition, so the residents can be obligated to build one, unlike by a valley where there's no such custom. Now, if only one person is building the wall, it said that he should build a sign to indicate his sole ownership, specifically on the other end of his neighbor's side, extending the wall slightly. It can't be on his own side, as then the neighbor could just attach his own extension, and additionally there's no concern of the neighbor just cutting the extension off, as that would be noticeable. It brings other variations on this. Another method of making a sign on a wall marking ownership is to put a lime coating on the opposite side. Additionally, if the wall is made out of palm fronds, a sign could be made by arranging the tips to be woven together on the opposite side. Others say this could be undone, so a document just needs to be written up. Finally, if both sides consent to a wall, it says they should make signs on both sides. This would specifically be necessary if, during the building, one side makes a sign. So, to show that both own the wall, the other one also makes a sign. Alternatively, others say that it's a case with palm fronds, and it's refuting the opinion that a sign cannot be made with such a material. New Mishnah. If somebody has fields on three sides around his neighbor, and he puts fences all around, like so, the resident in the center is not obligated to help pay for these walls. However, some say if the resident in the center builds a fourth wall at the bottom, thereby making official use of all three walls, he becomes obligated to chip in for all of the walls. The Gemara says we do hold like this latter opinion. Additionally, some say he needs to chip in for the other fences no matter what they cost, even if they were expensive. Others say he only needs to chip in for the cost value of a cheap reed fence. But then what exactly is the dispute in the Mishnah as to what the center field owner needs to pay for, besides for whether it's for all of the expensive walls or not? So it gives a few suggestions that they're actually debating if he should be paying the value of a watchman or of a cheap reed fence, or it's that they're debating if he needs to chip in for the fourth fence or for all four of the fences. Or the debate could be as to who's building this last fence, as to if it's the outer or inner neighbor that would create responsibility for him to pay for all the fences. There's two variations on this last one. It quotes a few instances of a case like this occurring and some similar ones. New Mishnah. If a courtyard wall collapsed, every neighbor needs to chip in to build it back up to 4 cubits tall. Everybody is later presumed to have chipped in, unless specific proof is brought otherwise. It doesn't need to be rebuilt higher than 4 cubits, but if one of the neighbors decides to do it anyways, and then a second neighbor builds a parallel wall opposite of the same height with intent to extend the roof over, he shows he's benefiting from the first wall, and even before the second guy builds the roof, he's obligated to help pay for the first full wall. Additionally, he isn't presumed to have helped pay for it unless he brings proof. The Gemara says there's a debate if the time for a man to pay a loan comes up, and he says he already paid it. Some say he's not believed, as we don't presume people pay their loans early, and others disagree and say he would be believed. So it debates both of these opinions from our Mishnah, where there's an apparent presumption to have paid for the wall in the first case, and a presumption of the inverse in the second case. So it said both are different. In the first case, as each row of stones is being set down, it's considered time to pay the loan. And then in the latter case, the builder of the parallel wall didn't realize that he would be liable to pay for the opposite wall, so it's also not comparable. It's also said that the law we hold like is that there's a presumption that a loan is not paid early, so if somebody claims that they had paid their loan early, they're not believed until they prove it. Based on this, it's asked if a lender demanded payment a bit after the due date, and the borrower claimed he repaid it before the due date came up, would he possibly actually be believed here, as he had the option to just say he had paid it after the due date, wherein he would have just been automatically believed, but for some reason he said he paid it before. So does this create a presumption that he's actually telling the truth? It argues a few different sources on this point, but they're all disproven and it remains unresolved. On the point that if the second neighbor builds a second wall parallel to the first, he's responsible to chip in for the first wall, as he presumably is making use of it. Some say if he only built half the wall parallel, he'd still need to chip in fully, but if it's attached to the corner, he only needs to pay for the extension that he's actually using. And others say by half a wall, he doesn't need to chip in, but would say that if he started installing settings for crossbeams, then he would be responsible to pay for the opposite wall. Related, it said that windows constructed into a wall don't create a presumption that the neighbor paid for part of a wall, and even if there are crossbeam settings installed, that still wouldn't create a presumption that the neighbor had chipped in, as the wall owner could say that he figured his neighbor might want to build an opposite wall and crossbeam, so he was preemptively building settings so that way his wall wouldn't be damaged if he decided to eventually do that. It's also said if somebody established the right with his neighbor to place thick crossbeams across his wall, then he's also allowed to put thin crossbeams, and if he had only established the right to place thin crossbeams, it's a debate if he can then also put across thick ones. Similarly, if somebody established the right to let water run off of his roof into his neighbor's entire courtyard, he can definitely also let it run off through a drain into one spot. And if somebody established the right to let water run off through a drain into one spot, it's a debate if he can then let it go across the entire roof. It's also a debate if a structure with a willow branch roof is unique in this case, as the water runoff is much more concentrated. Similarly, if somebody's renting an apartment in a large building, he has the right to use the inside of the beams and walls up to a distance of 4 cubits, including the roof, which is not the wall of the opening entrance. Others say he can, but he just can't use the plot of land behind the apartment, and others say he can even use that piece of land. Related, if a beam is built across a neighbor's wall to a hut for shade, if it stays there uncontested for over 30 days, this creates a presumption that the beam owner purchased the rights to put it there and he can leave it. If, however, the hut in question is a sukkah, the beam creates a presumption of permissibility after only 7 days, and if the beam was attached with cement, this creates an immediate presumption of permissibility. Back to points on visual trespass, it says if there are two houses on opposite ends of a public domain, they both need to make a 4-cubit high fence on at least half of their wall, on opposite sides, although overlapping slightly in the center. This would actually apply also with a private domain in the center. It just mentioned a public domain for a few listed reasons. Additionally, the specifics of this case show that if one man built half his fence before the other, and only then they went to court and obligated them to build a full division, the first man can't be forced to just finish his roof. The other man actually needs to build this misaligned parallel half on his own. Another case, if somebody owns a roof that overlooks his neighbor's courtyard, he needs to build a 4-cubit high fence. However, he would hold that between two adjacent roofs, there would only need to be a 10-handbreadth high fence so as to create a boundary marker that can't be crossed and to establish a clear line that if a thief crosses, he can be arrested. This is clarified. Additionally, if there are two adjacent courtyards, one higher than the other, a wall must be built, but regarding the part of the wall that goes from the bottom courtyard to reach the upper one, it's a debate if the upper courtyard person needs to pay for it. We bring a source which says he does need to. There's another case brought which results in the establishment that if a 2-story house starts sinking into the ground, the upstairs neighbor can prevent the downstairs neighbor from demolishing the house, as the lower story is still technically habitable so long as it extends above 10 handbreadths to the ground, and also so long as this was not stipulated prior. This is qualified and discusses some related incidents. The resulting rulings are that if a person built a wall behind somebody's window and offered to rebuild his other wall with new windows, the resident can still prevent the wall from being built, even if he only uses the house for storage. If two brothers inherited property, one receiving a house and one a garden, and one built a wall on the directly adjacent garden and blocking off the windows, he can leave the wall. This is qualified. Another brought case, some orphans had a promissory note and a receipt was brought claiming it was paid, but it was debated if it was actually a forgery, so it was ruled to just leave it and do nothing. And this last one, it does argue further if this is the ruling. New Mishnah. Some say a resident of a courtyard can be compelled to build a gatehouse and door. Others say it doesn't strictly need a gatehouse. Similarly, some say the residents of a city can be compelled to build a surrounding wall, double doors, and a crossbar. Others say it doesn't need a surrounding wall. To be a qualifying citizen for this that must pay these taxes, you must be a resident for 12 months or just have purchased a house. The Gemara explains a gatehouse is considered to be a good thing if it's not blocking off the poor, meaning if it's outside the door of the courtyard. Alternatively, it's that the gatehouse didn't have a door, thereby allowing the poor to enter, or alternatively, it's that it had a door but no lock, or alternatively, it's that it had a lock but it was on the outside. There's a debate if a courtyard far from a public road needs a gatehouse. Those that say it does is as sometimes there'll be traffic on the public road so people wouldn't go around and by the courtyard. Similarly, there's debate if there's a requirement to build a city wall even if it's far from the border, and the logic, why yes, is that it's possible invaders will go far past the border and eventually reach the city. Additionally, it's said that the tax for these structures is collected according to individual wealth, and possibly also proximity to the city's edge, but not by the number of household members. Some say this wall tax doesn't apply to the sages, as God protects them, and it brings a few verses as a source. It mentions some other unique exemptions from taxes and the related verses. There's a story, the sage Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi opened food storehouses for the poor after a famine, but said only learned individuals could enter and take food. One of this sage's students decided to disguise himself and pretended to be an ignoramus and begged for food. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi relented, and he started to feel bad having given food to an unlearned person, because he said that misfortune only comes to the world because of them, but he found out the person was actually a student and then decided to open his storehouses to everybody. Now, we said that after 12 months, a person is considered a citizen of a city and must pay certain taxes. This is particularly the citizens as opposed to the residents, which is a slightly different status as seen in some other cases. Additionally, this 12-month period is specifically before taxes are charged for boards for the city walls. Much earlier than that, after 30 days, the new citizen is expected to contribute to the soup kitchen. After 3 months, he's supposed to contribute to the community charity fund. After 6 months, he needs to start giving clothes to the poor. And after 9 months, he needs to start contributing towards burying the poor. Broadly, the city wall taxes and similar are charged from anybody that benefits from them, so this would include orphans but exclude the sages. It cites some related incidents on this. It mentions some points on the greatness of redeeming captives and discusses the previously mentioned community charities. The community charity box was run by 2 people, as one person can't be appointed an authority over the public, and the charity collectors are supposed to seize pledges, so long as the man is wealthy. It also brings some teachings on the greatness of charity collectors. Also, charity collectors are not supposed to do anything that could make it look like they're stealing, like they can't split up. If they find coins, they shouldn't pocket them, and similar. They're related points. This goes further. It said that the charity collectors should not be the ones dispersing the funds. Similarly, the temple treasurers shouldn't be expending the funds themselves. If a poor man asks for food, they should check his eligibility, but if a poor man asks for clothes, he's given it immediately, as people wouldn't pretend to be poor and wear lackluster clothing to get some free clothes. It's also based on a verse. Others say it's the exact inverse, that we'd freely give food as the poor man is hungry and shouldn't be made to wait, while by clothes he should be investigated. And they also bring a verse that apparently implies, like, their opinion. Related, if there's a poor man around and he isn't collecting door to door, he's given a bit more than a specific set amount of bread and flour, and he's given a bed and a pillow. If the poor man is around for Shabbos, then he's also given 3 meals. This is discussed. It's also said that a person should give at an absolute minimum a third of a shekel coin each year, based on a verse, although realistically the laws of Ma'aser apply, meaning you should always give 10% of your total income. Related, it said that one who causes somebody to do a charitable act is greater than the one who actually does it, as his task was more difficult. It quotes a few verses on the importance of giving charity. Further points on the great importance of charity are brought, and discusses some various laws of ritual and purity. More on charity, it is said to be exceptionally great to do it in secret so as to not embarrass anybody, and there are lots of blessings given to those who give to the poor. It's also said that those that frequently give charity will be rewarded with wisdom, wealth, and knowledge based on some scriptural verses. In fact, one Roman official, Tyrannus Rufus, asked Rabbi Akiva why, if God loves the poor, doesn't he help them? And Rabbi Akiva answers that way others have an opportunity to help them by giving charity and be saved from Gehenna. The analogy given was of a king who punished his son, imprisoned him, and ordered nobody to feed him, so one man went and brought him some food, and the king was actually thankful. It was also said that the obligations of charity always apply, even in exile. Therefore, the point on the importance of giving charity, it said doing so protects the Jewish people, and that it brings Mashiach closer. Related, it said there are 10 strong things. A mountain, which is broken by iron, which is melted by fire, which is extinguished by water, which is carried by clouds, which are scattered by wind, which are carried by the body, which is broken by fear, which is dispelled by wine, which is lessened by sleep, and death is stronger than all of these, and charity itself is stronger than death. Therefore, the points on the importance of charity and its protective attributes. It said that charity given in secret protects the giver from an unnatural death. Therefore, the points on the importance of charity, and it said it's great if given altruistically or even unaltruistically from a Jewish person, as they still do it to fulfill God's will. But for others, it's said to be a wrong thing if it's given to receive a reward unaltruistically, as they'd regret the act if they don't receive a reward. There are additional points on this. It brings various other instances further expressing this great importance of giving charity. New Mishnah. A man cannot force his courtyard to be divided unless there are at least 4 cubits for him and his neighbor. A grain field is not divided unless there are 9 kav, which was an old measurement, for each neighbor. Others say 9.5 kav. A vegetable garden isn't divided unless there are half a kav per partner, and others say a quarter kav. A salon, a hall, a dovecot, a coat, a bathhouse, an olive press, and an irrigated field are all not divided unless there's a proper share for each neighbor. Probably anything that, if divided, would retain its name would be divided, and if not, it would not be divided. If both parties consent to divide the property, they can do so with even less than the listed minimum measurements. Scrolls of scripture cannot be divided even if both parties consent. The Gemara says the 4-cubit minimum for dividing a courtyard excludes the entrances, which it then sources. Related, if a courtyard has houses and it's being divided, sources seem to imply that for each entrance to a house, 4 cubits are granted, and the remainder is divided equally. If one partner had an entrance 8 cubits long, he receives those 8 cubits, 4 cubits wide. If there's a hole for date pits, the owner receives 4 cubits on each side of the hole, so long as one side wasn't specifically designated as an entrance. It's debated if the owner of a pavilion gets the 4 cubits in front when the courtyard is divided. Some say only specifically by a Roman pavilion, which had lower walls. Specifically, it said that a porch, a Roman pavilion, and a staircase to a gallery all give 4 cubits to their owner when the courtyard is divided. It said 4 cubits are not given to a chicken coop, as the chickens climb in and out on their own without help. A building with only half a roof is said to not receive 4 cubits, which is explained. Related principles are discussed regarding residents' rights regarding a mavoi alley. For instance, it said if there are alleys connecting to cities, the residents of one city can prevent the residents of the other city from closing these off, even if other routes exist. Also, if the alley from a city leads to a public thoroughfare, the people of the public thoroughfare can prevent the residents from blocking off the alley throughout the entire alley. Now, there was a debate as to the minimum amount of a grain field that can be divided. Some said 9 kav, others said 9.5 kav. It's explained this variance is based on the soil quality. In Babylonia, it was said each party needs to, at a minimum, receive an area that takes 1 day to plow, which it then defines. When dividing a water hole, each person should receive enough to draw water for each day. And then when dividing a vineyard, each person should receive 3 kav, which it said was not a point that was derived logically. Related, it said that since the destruction of the first temple, the power of prophecy was taken from prophets and given to sages. This is seen as sages would explain a ruling, and would later be found to also have been taught, like they said, as a tradition from Mount Sinai. Others said that since the destruction of the temple, prophecy was actually given to the insane and to children, and it cites some incidents of this. It also quotes some medical advice. When a firstborn inherits, he receives the firstborn portion of land and the typical inheritance, and both of these plots should be adjacent. It's a debate if the same would apply to a man who does yibum, the levirate marriage. A case is brought, a man purchased land next to his father's land, and when the inheritance was being divided, he requested this property as it was adjacent to his. It was ruled the other brothers could refuse this, and it brings some other instances of similar institutions. For instance, if there's a field bordered by a river and by a canal on each side, and it's being divided between 2 brothers, it should be divided into 8 segments from the corners, like this, so that way both get an equal amount of field next to the canal and the river. We said if 2 partners owned a mansion, they can only divide it if it's large enough for both of them to retain a proper share. It's a debate if one partner can compel the other to dissolve this partnership. It argues this from various cases. It gets into a related discussion as to whether various parts of scripture can be combined into a single scroll and the number of lines that must be left blank between certain books within the text. These and related principles are discussed along with the standard measurements of a Torah scroll. This relates to the structure of the Ark, wherein there's a debate as to how all the items stored within fit, being the sets of the tablets and the Torah scroll written by Moshe. So based on this, it tries to determine the dimensions of the scroll based on the dimensions of the Ark. This is additionally discussed, and related it mentions that Moshe was commended for destroying the tablets. It also gives the order of the books of prophets, of course being Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and the 12 prophets, or in Hebrew, Yehoshua, Shoftim, Shmuel, Malachim, Yirmiyahu, Yecheskel, and Yeshaya. The order is additionally explained. Further, it said that Moshe wrote the Torah, being the 5 books of Moses, and also the passage of Bilam within, and also the book of Job. Yehoshua wrote the book of Joshua, and the last 8 verses of the Torah, which cover the passing of Moshe. Samuel wrote his own book, and the book of Judges, and the book of Ruth. King David wrote the book of Psalms, Tehillim, along with the 10 elders who composed parts of individual psalms, being Adam, Melchizedek, Abraham, Moshe, and others. Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, wrote his own book, the Book of Kings and of Lamentations. Chizkiah and his assistants wrote the books of Isaiah, Yeshaya, Proverbs, Song of Songs, Shirashirim, and Ecclesiastes, Koheles, which were actually written by King Solomon, King Shlomo, but he compiled them. And the remainder of the books were written by the men of the Great Assembly, although Ezra wrote his own book and the genealogy from Chronicles up until himself, and the remainder was finished by Nehemiah, son of Chachaliah. Some say that the last 8 verses of the Torah were nevertheless actually written by Moshe, which creates some variance as to how they are read. The source for these points on authorship are all individually qualified and discussed. There's debate as to when exactly Job Eov lived. Some said during the time that Moshe sent the spies into Israel. Others said Job wasn't ever real, he's just entirely a parable. Others said he was there during the Babylonian exile. This actually expands into a broader debate as to whether Job was even Jewish. It additionally expounds on the verses from the book of Job, giving some additional explanations to the story. This incident is spoken on further. It additionally expounds on Job's great righteousness and also on a few of his improper statements. These are additionally discussed. It also speaks on Avraham for a bit. It says in the verse that he was blessed bakol, which means with everything. There are a few interpretations as to what this means. Some say it means he was given a daughter. Some say it means he was given a daughter who he named Bakol. Others say that it means that all the kings came to him for advice due to his great knowledge in astrology. Others say it means that Abraham was given a precious stone that could cure anybody who looked at it, and when Abraham passed, it was then placed in the sun. Others say that it means that his grandson, Esau, waited until after he had passed to rebel, which it expands on. And others say that his son, Ishmael, repented during his lifetime, which it sources. There are further points on this. It said that there are 3 people that the evil inclination has no power over, being Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that there were 6 men that the angel of death had no dominion over, and that their souls were taken by God, being Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. The relevant verses are all cited. It's also said that they, along with Jacob's son Binyamin, that their bodies do not decay. Additionally, 4 men would never have died but for the sin of the tree of knowledge, establishing death. Binyamin, Amram, Moshe's father, Yishai, David's father, and Kilov, David's son. And all of these are tradition besides for Yishai, who the verse implies like. And that's the end of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Tractate Bava Basra continues on laws of property ownership and avoiding damaging the property of others. The first Mishnah says, a person is not allowed to dig a pit in his property near his neighbor's pit, and he also must place a ditch, vault, irrigation channel, or a launderer's pool at least 3 handbreadths away from his neighbor's wall. And also the walls of the pit or ditch, or otherwise, need to be lined with lime. Similarly, olive refuse, manure, salt, lime, and flint must be placed at least 3 handbreadths away from his neighbor's wall, or he could have lime applied to the wall. Seeds, using a plow, and urine must be at least 3 handbreadths away from the wall. A mill must be at least 3 handbreadths away from a neighbor's wall, measured from the lower millstone, which is 4 handbreadths away from the upper millstone. An oven must be 3 handbreadths from the wall, measured from the oven's base, which is 4 handbreadths away from the upper rim. The Gemara clarifies the first point, that what it's actually saying is that a pit can't be dug next to a neighbor's pit, unless it's 3 handbreadths away from the wall of the pit. This shows that the standard width of the wall of a pit is 3 handbreadths, which is relevant by some laws of buying and selling. Related, it's asked if a person is allowed to build a pit right next to the property boundary, even before his neighbors build a pit opposite it. It said, if the locale has the practice to just generally dig pits, it's agreed to not be allowed. However, if this is not the case, some say it is permitted, as digging pits here is uncommon. Others say it isn't allowed, as the same way he wants to dig a pit, so too the neighbor might also want to. There's variance on this discussion. Anyways, it debates these 2 opinions from a number of sources. Additional quotes are argued, citing many discussed cases to determine whether it's permissible to build a pit too close to a neighbor's property before he decides to build a pit on his own side. This is based on a broader debate which permeates this entire chapter as to whether the responsibility of preventing damage is upon the damage causer, which is the opinion of the sages, or is it like the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, that a person can do whatever he wants with his property and it's up to his neighbors to not get damaged. It was said that a launderer's pool must be 3 handbreadths away from a neighbor's wall. This is explained to be for a soaking pool, while a scrubbing pool must be 4 cubits away. There's variation on this source. Now, it was said that a pit must be 3 handbreadths away from the wall of a neighbor's pit, and also that the wall must be coated with lime. Now it asks, is this that there must be a distance and the application of lime, or is that you could do either or? It argues this from a few quotes. Next, it was said that olive refuse, manure, salt, and flint must be 3 handbreadths away from a neighbor's wall. These are all listed as they generate heat. Elsewhere, by laws of insulating food for Shabbos, it mentions all of these besides for flint. It debates why that's not mentioned there. A couple of suggested answers are brought and disproven, and it says in the end it's because flint isn't used to insulate as it would break the pot. Also, by insulation, it mentioned wet sand as an insulator, which is not mentioned over here in this Mishnah, as it's already covered by the irrigation channel, which by the way is permanent, unlike the launderer's pool, which was why both of those were also stated. It said seeds and a plow must be 3 handbreadths away from a neighbor's wall. This is not redundant, as you could plant seeds by hand without a plow, and a plow could be used for trees. Also, seeds are necessary to mention, in spite of the prohibition against putting water in your neighbor's wall similar to urine, which was also mentioned as in Israel, irrigation was unnecessary thanks to the rain. The reason planting seeds near a wall is forbidden is in case the roots break up the ground directly beneath the wall and push up the soil, damaging the wall. It's forbidden to urinate within 3 handbreadths from a wall, but emptying a chamber pot is permitted, as similarly pouring water from a pot is allowed. Others dispute this opinion from a different source, which allows urination next to walls of different types of materials. Some related points on the laws of impurity are discussed. Specifically, impurity can be transmitted through a wall if there's a hole in the wall, at least 1 handbreadth by 1 handbreadth. However, it asks if there's an item lodged in this gap that has been abandoned. It would prevent the spread of impurity. However, what if it wasn't abandoned? For instance, a wafer, which is going to be eaten. It argues this point from a few different sources. It additionally debates this, citing many different types of lodged items and debating their use, such as dried figs, which could be rotted, with a barrel, which could be facing the wrong way, with grass, which could be inedible, and otherwise. Anyways, on the point of grass, it said that grass that grows by itself near an opening to a neighbor's wall could block impurity. So the question is, how could grass be allowed to grow anywhere near a neighbor's wall? If, as stated, it's impermissible. So either it could be that the wall is of a ruin in this case, or it's that the grass is 3 handbreadths away, but it grows long enough to reach the gap. The remaining ones are qualified. Small scraps of fabric can block impurity in a wall, which can be similar to sackcloth, particularly as they have little practical use. A loose piece of animal flesh, which could be of a non-kosher animal tied near the wall. There's a bird that could block the gap, which has to be bound and non-kosher, so it also won't be eaten or used as a pet, as it also would be a species that scratches. Also, a non-Jewish person can block the gap, and there's no concern of him leaving, as the case must be that he's the prisoner of the king or something along those lines. There are various others, and they're individually qualified. Similarly, there's debate if a wall made entirely of salt is a valid structure. Some say it depends on the type of salt. Others say it depends if there's a beam in place above locking the salt in place. The last point was that a mill must be distant from a wall, and that's because it makes loud noises and can damage the wall. Also, based on the given measurements of an oven here, it shows that the lower base of an oven extends a handbreadth further than the top, which is again relevant by the laws of buying and selling. New Mishnah. A person cannot set up an oven in a house unless there are 4 cubits of space above to prevent the ceiling from catching fire. If the oven is on a second story, it must be on a layer of plaster 3 handbreadths thick, so that way it will prevent the floor from catching fire. If it's a stove, the plaster needs to only be 1 handbreadth thick. If the oven nevertheless sets something on fire, there's just a debate if he's still liable to repay for the damages. Additionally, a person cannot open a bakery or a dye shop underneath somebody's storeroom due to the smoke, and he also can't put a cattle barn underneath due to the smell. If the storeroom is for wine, however, only the cattle barn cannot be opened underneath. However, the bakery or dye shops are fine. The Gemara says a different source requires 4 handbreadths of plaster under an oven and 3 beneath a stove. But that's explained to be by a baker's oven, which is constantly lit, unlike what we're discussing, which are standard household ovens. Now, opening a cattle barn beneath a storeroom is forbidden, but if the cattle barn was put there first, it's permitted. It gives a few suggestions as to what constitutes the designation of a room as a cattle barn, but it's left unresolved. Cattle barns alone specifically cannot be beneath a wine storage room, as smoke would be good for the wine, albeit not candle smoke, but cattle smell is not good for the wine, as would be the storage of a particular type of plant called aspasta. New Mishnah. If a courtyard resident wants to put a store in its courtyard, the other residents can prevent him, saying it'll be too noisy. However, a person can manufacture utensils in his house to sell elsewhere, and people can't complain about the noise, nor about the noise of a mill, or the noise of children. The Gemara says this latter case, which says a neighbor can't complain about the noise of children, it asks what's the difference between that and customers. Some just say by the children case, it's just referring to a private courtyard. Others say it's referring to after the historical institution of the mandate for teachers in every town, so people were no longer allowed to complain about children being taught and making noise. It describes this institution and mentions proper methods of teaching, such as that if a student is being reprimanded, it should be done gently, so that way he'll eventually wind up learning the material properly. This decree applied specifically towards Jewish children, and additionally, the head teacher of the town can be prevented from making too much noise. There are some just general institutions and proper teaching methods mentioned. It's improper to generally have a student go between towns, as it could be dangerous on the way. The standard number of students per teacher was 25. So at 50, they would get 2 teachers, and if there were 40, this teacher gets an assistant who the town helps pay for. Additionally, a slower teacher isn't just replaced if a faster teacher comes along, although others do disagree. Also, if it's between a slow but precise teacher or a fast but imprecise teacher, it's a debate which is preferable. This is sourced. It's also said that a teacher, a butcher, a bloodletter, and many others are able to cause a serious loss if they err. So, because of this, they're considered forewarned on the subject. It's also said, according to one opinion, that the resident of an alley can build a mill and then can prevent any other resident from doing so, as they'd be cutting off his livelihood. It debates this from a few different sources with some additional opinions on the topic. Additionally, if the resident of the alley is a teacher, he cannot prevent anybody else from teaching there. A number of relevant incidents are discussed. New Mishnah. If somebody's wall is near his neighbor's wall, he cannot put another wall in between unless it's 4 cubits away from the neighbor's wall. If a neighbor has windows on his house, a wall built on the other's property must be 4 cubits away, and the wall must be either 4 cubits higher or lower than the windows. The Gemara clarifies the first case being that a wall typically cannot be too near a neighbor's wall anyways, so it must be that somebody had a wall near his neighbor's wall 4 cubits away, and then it collapsed, and the new wall being rebuilt must still be 4 cubits away. This 4 cubit gap is necessary as it creates a walkway for people to go through, which is good for the dirt. Additionally, this necessary gap is only if the neighbor's wall is for a garden. If it's for a courtyard, it can be closer. Others say by a new town, it must have a 4 cubit gap by a courtyard wall. Later, it says by the window, the reason for the gap is to allow light in, not to create a walkway, so it's explained that this wall discussed is perpendicular. The gap discussed here must be a handbreadth on a sloping wall that cannot be looked over. Now, we said that it must be a 4 cubit gap in our Mishnah, which is explained to be that there are 2 perpendicular walls that must be 4 cubits apart. Additionally, it'll be said in a minute that a wall must be 4 cubits away from a roof gutter to allow room for the neighbor to put up a ladder. There's no mention of people walking in that area, as this is on a slanted roof, so people would anyways be walking beneath the overhang. New Mishnah. A ladder must be placed 4 cubits away from a neighbor's dovecot so weasels cannot climb up to get the birds. A wall must be 4 cubits away from the gutter of a neighbor's roof to allow room for him to put up a ladder. The Gemara explains the ladder isn't allowed by the dovecot, allowing weasel access. Showing a causative act which damages something is forbidden. A related incident is brought. New Mishnah. A dovecot must be set 50 cubits away from a city. Similarly, a person shouldn't build a dovecot unless he has 50 cubits of land around it in each direction. Others say it must be the distance of 4 kor, which was a measurement, in each direction, which is approximately 273.86 cubits in each direction, which is the distance a dove flies in one flight. However, if the dovecot is purchased from a prior owner, the property can be as small as it wants, and it can still be used. The Gemara asks, why is a dove's flight distance here defined as 50 cubits, when a Mishnah in Bava Basra defined it as 8,000 cubits, preventing traps being set out in that radius? It said that after 50 cubits, they'll eat for the first 50 cubits and then won't eat further. So if the issue is damaging others' property, then that won't be an issue at this distance. It additionally discusses these cases. Now, if the dovecot had been placed prior, it can be permitted, as it has its establishment, and such a thing would be allowed, but it can't be permitted by something like smoke or an outhouse, which are definite sources of damage. New Mishnah. If a young dove was found within 50 cubits of a dovecot, it belongs to the owner of the dovecot. If it was found further than this, it belongs to whoever found it. If the bird was found between 2 dovecots, it goes to whichever it was closer to, and if it was right in the middle, it's divided. The Gemara explains, a lost object can either be returned by majority, meaning it goes to where a majority of similar items are, or by proximity, by location. It said that between the two, majority has priority. This doesn't contradict our case, as ours is discussing a young bird which can't even fly, so it's not hopping more than these 50 cubits. One sage asked, what if a bird has one leg within 50 cubits of one dovecot, and within 50 cubits of another one? And he was ejected from the study hall for asking such a pedantic question. Anyways, it continues trying to find sources for the initial principle that majority supersedes proximity regarding lost objects. Additional related incidents are brought. New Mishnah. A tree must be placed 25 cubits away from the edge of a city. If it's a carob or a sycamore, it must be 50 cubits away. Some say all barren trees must be 50 cubits away. If the tree was nevertheless planted, it must be cut down, and the city doesn't need to provide recompense. If, however, the tree was there first and then the city was built, the tree must be cut down and he'll be provided recompense. If they're not sure which came first, the city or the tree is cut down without recompense. The Gemara explains the trees must be removed so as to beautify the city. This is necessary to state according to the opinion that the 1,000 cubits of land around the ancient cities of Israel could have trees planted within. The Remaining points are also qualified. New Mishnah. A permanent granary must be distant 50 cubits away from a city. Similarly, a permanent granary can only be built in your property if you have 50 cubits around it in each direction. Additionally, the granary must be distant from his neighbor's saplings or plowed field to prevent his chaff from damaging them. The Gemara explains this latter point by the chaff as a lesser distance than 50 cubits, as it refers to a temporary granary, which is one small enough that a shovel wouldn't be used for winnowing. Alternatively, it's that it also refers to 50 cubits. It's just explaining that it's the distance to prevent chaff damage. It debates the first opinion from a source which explains like the second one. Anyways, it mentions that chaff can damage a plowed field as it can over-fertilize it. New Mishnah. Animal carcasses, graves, and tanneries must be distant 50 cubits from a town as they have a foul smell. Additionally, it must be to the east of the town so the wind won't be as strong. Others say it can be on any side but the west side. A flax pool must be distant from vegetables, and leeks must be distant from onions, and mustard plants must be distant from bees. Rabbi Yossi disagrees with all of these, as was mentioned earlier. The Gemara explains the opinion which allowed a tannery on any side of a town, besides for its west side, maintains the opinion that it still must be 50 cubits away. The west wind is referred to as a constant. It's not the harshest, which is the south wind, which is blocked by the angel Ben Nate to protect the world. Rather, it's said that the west is in the direction of the Shekhinah, the divine presence, so it's improper to have a tannery in that direction. There's actually a broader debate as to which direction the Shekhinah is in, which is sourced from a number of verses. It also describes the path of the sun as it circles around the globe, giving some general measurements. It additionally quotes a number of verses on the wind. It said, if somebody wants to become knowledgeable, he should pray facing south. If he wants wealth, he should pray facing north, although traditionally we face east towards Jerusalem when we pray. New Mishnah. A tree must be distant 25 cubits away from a neighbor's pit, and a carob or sycamore tree must be 50 cubits away, no matter the elevation. If the pit was there first, the tree must be cut down. If the tree was there first, it gets to stay. If they're not sure which came first, the tree gets to stay. Rabbi Yossi says even if the pit came first, the tree can stay, as the same way you could dig a pit, he's also allowed to plant a tree. The Gemara further defines its cases, and it says it rules in accordance with Rabbi Yossi. However, he does clarify that a person can't directly damage the property of his neighbor. Instances are brought to illustrate this. New Mishnah. A tree or grapevine must be distanced 4 cubits away from a neighbor's field border. If there's a fence in between, they can go up to the fence. If somebody's tree roots extended into the neighbor's property, the neighbor can excavate 3 handbreadths of dirt to remove roots so he can plow. If the neighbor was digging a pit, a ditch, or a vault, he can cut through and retain any roots. The Gemara says in Israel, where larger plows were used, there had to be a 4-cubit gap. In Babylonia, they used smaller plows, so 2 cubits were sufficient. This is additionally discussed, citing some relevant incidents on digging up a neighbor's tree roots. It debates the status of roots growing from temple property, and it says that roots within 16 cubits of a tree sustain the tree and belong to the tree owner, and further than this, it would belong to the other landowner. Based on this measurement, it said that a tree within 16 cubits of a neighbor's field is stealing its nutrients and would be exempt from the Bikurim tithe, which is the first fruits tithe. This measurement is additionally described calculating area within a circle radius. It debates the principle and the calculation from some additional sources. New Mishnah. If the branches of somebody's tree extend over a neighbor's field, the neighbor can cut branches sufficient to clear room for his ox and plow with an ox goad raised above to walk through. If it's a carob or a sycamore tree with denser branches, he can cut anything up to the precise measured line of the border. If the neighbor's property is an irrigated field, some say any trees can be cut along the line, others say any barren tree can be cut along the line. The Gemara says this last statement, that it only applies to barren trees, is specifically referring to an ordinary field in the first case. New Mishnah. If the branches of somebody's tree extend over the public domain, branches can be cut sufficient to allow a camel rider to pass through. Some say it's a camel laden with flax, others say that it can be cut along the lines to prevent the transfer of impurity. The Gemara argues the source of this opinion, that future damages aren't dealt with, as it's permitting the tree limbs to grow back, apparently. It's explained that a camel and rider is a greater amount in size than a camel and flax. According to the opinion that the camel and flax is the maximum cutting distance, he'd say that a typical rider, which is more than this, he just needs to bend down a bit. The branches creating impurity is an issue of there being a tent created, so thinning the branches is insufficient, preventing items lodged within. It also needs to be cut to the line. And that's the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Tractate Bava Basra discusses the laws of acquisition in regards to property. The first Mishnah says, living on a piece of property for a period of time establishes a presumption of ownership, an acquisition, or a chazaka, as it's called. For instance, if somebody was seen dwelling within a certain house for 3 years continuously, it establishes a presumption of ownership for him towards that house, or an acquisition. The same would apply to a pit, ditch, vault, dovecot, bathhouse, olive press, building, irrigated field, a slave, or any other property that provides constant benefit, that the presumption of ownership is established after using this piece of property for 3 continuous years. With a rain-watered field, this ownership is established within 3 years, but not a continuous period. Rabbi Yishmael says, this refers to 3 months in the first year, wherein you could squeeze 1 full crop in the last few months, then 12 months in the middle year, and then 3 months in the last year, totaling 18 months. Rabbi Akiva says it must be for 1 month in the first year, requiring a smaller crop to be established, then 12 months in the middle, and then 1 month in the last year, so 14 months total. Rabbi Yishmael clarifies his opinion refers to a grain field, but by a field of trees, if he had harvested his grapes, picked his olives, and gathered his dried figs within a single year, that would count as if it was done over 3 years and create a full acquisition. The Gemara debates the source for this notion that an acquisition is established after 3 years of ownership. It's suggested to be from the muad ox, a dangerous ox, which is established after it gores 3 times, which was discussed way back in Tractate Bava Basra. Additionally, by property, it would also be necessary for the man on the property to advance a claim on it, just to effectuate his acquisition over 3 years, unlike by the bull. Additionally, the two are actually comparable, as the bull needs to be warned about in its owner's presence, and by this property acquisition, if it's not the man's actual property, then the real owner would have definitely heard about it by word of mouth. So it's similar. Furthermore, harvesting 3 crops in 1 day is not effective to establish an acquisition, and this is similar to the ox, as the 3 gorings don't exist at the same time, so too the different crops must exist at different times. Based on this, it asks, why can't you harvest 3 crops of caper bushes, which grows super quickly over 3 days? And that's said to be because it's still considered to be one extended harvest, as they're still in development. And then growing aspasta, which is a type of animal fodder, with 3 crops over 30 days, would also be insufficient, as they won't be fully grown. Harvesting them over 3 months would work, but it's, as we said, like the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, that the only thing that requires 3 years to create an acquisition is a grain field. So that defines the muad ox as the source for Rabbi Yishmael specifically. So it suggests some verses the others could use as a source for this principle. Alternatively, after a few others, it suggests the notion that the first 2 years a person lives on somebody's property, he probably still holds onto his deed. After 3 years, he's probably lost it, so we don't force a person off of his property if it's contested after this point. And we assume that as he's been there for 3 years, it probably is. Additionally, in such a situation, if the property actually was owned by another man and he lodged a protest against the man who eventually stole his property, the property thief is held responsible to have held onto his deed, as he should have heard about the protest by word of mouth. Okay, very brief intermission. The entire Gemara, the Talmud, and in fact the entire Torah, have a commentary written on them by an individual named Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, an 11th century sage, who essentially compiled explanations and traditions from various sources of these various texts. His commentary is printed in every single edition of the Gemara, and in most editions of the Chumash, the Hebrew book compiling the Torah. And in fact, the Gemara and the Torah are most typically taught and learned in accordance with the commentary of Rashi. Anyways, unfortunately, Rashi actually passed away right in the middle of writing his commentary on the Gemara. You can see it right over here. It says his commentary stops. Fortunately, the commentary wasn't written in order of tractate, so most of the others have his commentary written in full, with a few exceptions. Rashi's grandson, a sage referred to as the Rashbam, then took over and finished his grandfather's work. However, they differ slightly in styles, and while Rashi chooses to be a bit more concise with his words, the Rashbam tends to expound on concepts a bit longer, and because of this, Tractate Bava Basra winds up being the longest tractate, around twice as long as many other tractates, a significant portion of which is just due to this extended commentary on each page. Although the tractate's fairly long and complex in its own right. Additionally, the other side of the page here is Tosfos, Rashi's other grandchildren, printed in all editions of the Gemara on the opposite side of Rashi, who mostly provide their own commentary, largely debating with their grandfather on various explanations. So those are the main 2 commentaries, although there are dozens of other commentaries printed in the back of the Gemara, giving additional explanations and asking various questions and answers, along with commentaries on those commentaries, and commentaries on the commentaries on the commentaries. So that's important to bear in mind. Anyways, that's just an aside on the topic of commentaries, Rashi, and Tosfos, which are all pieces of information that you should be aware of when studying Gemara or most other Jewish texts. Anyways, it was said that the 3 years of dwelling on property to create an acquisition must be consecutive, meaning not 3 years spread out over a long period. Specifically, this is speaking about where the field is left fallow every other year, even if those around him don't do this also. It does debate from other discussions as to whether the 3 years must be continuous. For instance, it says he must provide evidence of using the property by night too, not just by day. However, if there's a store made for daytime use alone, it would only require consecutive use during the day. This is qualified. It's also said if somebody used the entire piece of land for 3 years, besides for around 100 cubits in the corner, he acquires everything besides for that area, so long as it was suitable for planting. Others say it doesn't even need to be suitable for planting, as the man could have acquired it by putting his animals or his fruits there to make use of it. This is illustrated with a few examples. For instance, there's a case a man came to his house and saw that there was some person living there who claimed he had been living there for 3 years, creating an acquisition. The original owner claimed he hadn't protested as he'd been out of town in markets for the past 3 years. The person on the property said, well, he has witnesses that the original owner had come into town for 30 days, but the original owner claimed that he had done so, but he was preoccupied the whole time with his business, so he didn't realize that there was anybody living in his house. This was ruled to be a valid claim, and the man reclaimed his house. Another incident, a person came to his property and saw somebody living there and asked what he was doing here, and the resident said he had purchased it from some other person who claimed he had purchased it from you. So the original owner said, well, if you're admitting I originally owned it, you clearly haven't bought it from me, and it's ruled that he would get his land back. Yet another case, a man came to his property and saw somebody living there, and the resident claimed he had bought it from a third party, and the original resident said, yeah, well, that man was a thief. So the current resident said, but I have witnesses that I had asked you if I could purchase it from the third party, and you said I should. So the original owner said, well, that's because the third party stole it, but I figured it would be easier to reclaim it from you than to reclaim it from him, so I had you buy it. This was ruled to be valid, but it argues as to the sources. There are incidents cited. It's asked, if two people both argue that their ancestors held possession of a single piece of land and one provides witnesses that he'd been currently living there for the past 3 years, the land goes to him, as he could have just simply claimed he had purchased the land and used it for those 3 years. Others say he needed to have claimed that he had purchased it from the other man's ancestors. Based on this, there's a debate as to whether a person can advance a claim, come back, and then advance a new claim, and it rules that a person can do this. Furthermore, if two men both claim their ancestors owned the property and they both provide witnesses that they had used it for 3 years, but only one brought witnesses that his ancestors had used it, it debates as to who it goes to. This is additionally disputed further, and there are additional points. Another case is brought, a man asked somebody what he's doing on his land, and the current resident said, I bought it from you, and here's my deed as proof. The original owner said, well, that's a forged deed. The other said, actually, yes, it is a forged deed, but that's because I had the original deed, but then I lost it, so I figured I'd make a fake one so that way I had something to present in court. A similar case was disputed regarding a loan. Anyways, it's an argument, as on the one hand, he didn't need to admit that he had forged the document, he could have just said nothing, but on the other hand, it's still worthless as a document. There's another instance, it was said that a man was using land that belonged to orphans, but this man then claimed it was given to him by their father as collateral for a loan. He had then decided to keep the land past his limit so as to consume the produce to repay the debt as opposed to collecting the owed money from the orphans with an oath. It was ruled that this was not a valid claim for some listed reasons, and he had to return the land and collect his loan once the orphans were old enough. Another case, somebody left a date palm to his descendants, and two of them argued which of them were related closer to him to inherit the tree, one of them admitting the other was closer related, so he received the tree, but then it was debated if he should also receive the produce that the other man had claimed from the tree until then. It was said that as he had admitted to impermissibly using the tree, he was also admitting to impermissibly taking the produce, and therefore must return it. Anyways, it brings back up the case as to if two men say a piece of property was their ancestors, one brings witnesses for this, and the other, second man, brings witnesses that he had been on the property for 3 years. Some say the second man could have just claimed he had purchased the land, hence his usage of it for 3 years, so as he chose not to make that very believable claim, he's more likely to be believed as he could have just made it instead. Others say such a claim doesn't work here as the other man has witnesses to his point. A case is brought, a man claimed he was on somebody's property for 3 years, but could only bring witnesses that he was there for 2 years. Due to this lack, it said he needs to return the land and any produce he had taken. Although it is said if somebody's using a piece of land and then gets kicked off, he can still claim he was there as he had been permitted to eat the produce, and he then wouldn't need to repay for anything he had eaten, as it's unlikely he'd be so bold as to make this claim if it wasn't true, and documents for this weren't typically written, unlike by the actual land purchase. Yet another case, a man was on a field and the original owner showed up and asked what he was doing there, so the man said he had purchased it from him and had been dwelling there for the past 3 years, and then brought one witness that he had done so. This is said to be comparable to a different case wherein a man grabbed a silver ingot out of the hands of another person, and the original owner brought a single witness that this had occurred, and the grabber said, yes, it's true, but the ingot had belonged to me and I was just grabbing it back. This case with the ingot is debated as there's only a single witness, but that does reduce the significance of his admittance, but he also admitted that he had grabbed it, so he can't now take an oath as to what occurred, as he's now considered to be a thief. So, It was said the grabber is like somebody who's obligated to take an oath, but is unable to, and the rule in such a situation is that he needs to return the item. However, it's said that this case just isn't similar to ours, as here the single witness was to support the occupant, unlike by the ingot case, so the man wouldn't be obligated to take an oath. An actually comparable case would be if one witness testified that the resident had consumed 2 years' worth of produce and then needed to return it. Yet another incident. 2 men were fighting over a boat, both claiming it as their own. One of them demanded the court seize the boat until he could provide witnesses. It's rules the court does not seize the boat, but they did anyways here in this case, and it said if such a thing occurs, it said that they don't just release the boat to have them fight over it. Uniquely, it said if 2 men were disputing over property as to whether it belongs to either one of their ancestors and neither of them can prove it, it said they should just fight it out, essentially, as further evidence could be brought later. It additionally debates this point from other cases. Anyways, back to the original point, it said that if witnesses testify that the original owner was seen loading a basket of his field's produce onto the shoulders of the second man, the current resident, he's believed to acquire the property immediately without need for an acquisition. However, if the original owner, without the first 3 years at least, claims the other man was his sharecropper, he would be believed as he'd get to retain the field. Additionally, if the owner was his sharecropper working for him for over 3 years to prevent the field's ownership from shifting to the sharecropper, he needs to declare the property as his own, and the other man is only a sharecropper, as seen in some sources. It's also said a Jewish man can only claim property that belonged to a non-Jewish person through providing a deed as proof, and the same applies vice versa. However, if the Jewish man said that the non-Jewish man had purchased the land in front of an original owner, and then sold it to the Jewish man also before him, he's believed, as if he wanted to lie, he could have just claimed he had purchased it straight from the original owner. Additionally, as referenced earlier, it says if somebody takes a rope and a blade and says he's purchased some trees from a man's field, which he then harvests, he's believed, as typically people aren't so bold as to just make up that they have permission to cut down another person's trees. Other points, if somebody occupies a thin strip of land outside the border wall of a field for 3 years, this does not create an acquisition of the field, as the original owner can just say he wasn't using that produce right over there anyways, it was going to wild animals, so he hadn't protested him staying there. Additionally, if somebody uses a field by impermissibly harvesting orla fruits from trees in their first 3 years, this or from unripe grain in locations where it isn't used, from cracked, barren land, or if the field didn't yield any increase in what he had sown, it doesn't create an acquisition, which it then sources. Additionally, the members of the family of the Reish Galusa, the leaders of the Jewish people in Babylonia, could not establish ownership of others' property, and people couldn't establish ownership of theirs. Slaves also can be acquired, as mentioned, only after 3 years. Acquiring a baby takes effect immediately, even if the mother is also in the house. This is qualified. The opinions of Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva had disputed over a rain-watered field if it's acquired after 18 or 14 months. This establishment is based on if either holds that an acquisition can be made with a partially grown crop or not. It's also debated at length as to whether plowing the field can create an acquisition. Additionally, some derive that according to one opinion, if 30 trees were planted in a field, 10 over every 2,500 square cubits, you could harvest 10 every year for 3 years to create an acquisition. This applies only if the trees bear fruits on different years, and only if the trees are scattered across the fields. It's also said if one buyer performs a proprietary act to acquire trees and another man does a proprietary act to get a field, it debates who gets what between opinions. It is, however, stated if somebody sold land and retained the trees, he does also retain some land around the trees, that way he can plant new ones if they die. This even accords with the opinion that people typically sell land in a more generous manner, giving more, as will be explained later. If, however, somebody sold trees and retained the field, there's a debate if the buyer gets some land based on if people sell land generously or not. This is qualified. If other debates if harvesting the 30 trees over 3 years, as mentioned, would validly function to acquire the field. It's also said if somebody sells a palm tree, for instance, the purchaser gets the soil from the tree's base and then downwards to the furthest depths. Others disagree, as they say that to be sold the dirt beneath the tree, it needs to be clarified as a part of the sale. So if somebody wants to not sell the dirt beneath the tree they're selling, he should declare it so before 3 years pass. New Mishnah. There are 3 lands in Israel in regards to the laws of acquisition: Judea, Transjordan, and Galilee. So if the original owner was at a town in Judea and somebody lives on the property in Galilee for 3 years, it's not valid to create an acquisition. They need to be in the same province, presumably so that the original owner can protest if he wants to. Others disagree and say that 3 years are only to give time to the owner to be notified and to travel and claim his property. The Gemara clarifies, actually the first opinion does hold that the protest can be made from a different region. It was just an exception here where it was not permitted, as this was specifically during a dangerous time where such declarations didn't really get spread via word of mouth as people weren't really traveling as much. Additionally, Judea and Galilee were specified to show that they're considered to be separate provinces during dangerous times. It's a debate whether an acquisition can be made on a fugitive's property, as presumably he won't be able to lodge a complaint as he'll be out of the country, hiding from the government or something. But perhaps it could be valid, as maybe the protest could be lodged elsewhere. It's argued further, but it said if somebody becomes a fugitive due to his debts, he could make protests if he wanted, and therefore an acquisition after 3 years would be permitted. But if somebody was a fugitive for committing murder, an acquisition would not be effective, as there's no way this guy could validly make a protest. It also clarifies as to what constitutes an effective protest. Is said to involve claiming the resident as a thief who has taken his property and that he plans on reclaiming it in court. Now, if the original owner protested but told the witnesses to not tell the occupant, some say this is invalid, others say it is, as not telling it directly to the occupant, but the information will reach him eventually. If the witnesses told the protester that they're not telling the occupant about the protest on their own, the same debate applies. If the protester told the witnesses to just tell absolutely nobody, it's invalid. If the witnesses say they're telling nobody on their own, it's a debate. Some say it's invalid, others say that as they weren't forbidden from doing this, they just decided to not do this themselves, they'll tell somebody eventually. It additionally states an opinion, essentially that a protest lodged outside of the occupant's presence is considered to be a valid protest. However, regarding the lodging of the actual protest, some require it to be done before 2 witnesses, so they can testify it occurred, and others say it must be done before 3 witnesses to ensure that the protest will actually be spread out and heard by the occupant. Once a man does protest about somebody living on his property, it's said he doesn't need to do so again, although he should relodge it at the end of every 3 years. The protests, however, need to line up and not contradict each other to be effective. Some hold that a protest must be lodged before 2 witnesses, and he doesn't need to tell them to write a document. They can do so without him saying so. Notification of coercion to avoid a transaction, which is a totally separate thing, must be done before 2 witnesses, and there's no need to tell them to write the document. An admission of indebtedness must be done before 2 witnesses, and the man must tell the witnesses to write a document, otherwise they can't do so. Acquiring an item through an exchange must be done before 2 witnesses, and there's no need to tell them to write the document. The certification of documents must be done before 3 judges. The exchange acquisition doesn't need to have the writing of the document specified, even though it's not a court proceeding, as it's typically meant to be written down. Other laws on these unique types of documents are clarified. These and related are discussed. It's said that a gift document written in secret cannot be used to collect the gift. It's a debate as to what such a document is. Some say it's if the witnesses were told to write in hiding. Others say if the witnesses were not told to write it in public. There's a practical difference if the instructions were unspecified. It debates the use of such a secret gift document. If the instructions on the writing of the document were unspecified, it's rules that were concerned that such a document was actually written in secret and it's therefore considered to be void. New Mishnah. Any attempted acquisition of property via living there for a while must be accompanied by a claim for it to be considered valid. For instance, if the man was on the property for a while, but then said he was there just because nobody had kicked him off, he doesn't acquire the property. But if he said he's there because he purchased the land from its owner or it was given to him as a gift, it would result in a valid acquisition. Somebody who acquires the property by inheritance does not need a supporting claim. The Gemara explains this was necessary to state, as it shows, if somebody did purchase the property but lost the deed, so he isn't claiming that it was sold to him, the court doesn't go out of its way to suggest that the land was sold to him, and he possibly just lost the deed. It gives some instances of this principle. These are additionally discussed. For instance, if a man claims the property was sold to him by a third party after he'd been living there for a while, it's a debate if he needs to bring proof that this third party had ever lived in the property at all, as it's possible he just sold it. In fact, it's a debate if the third party can just be seen on the property, not even using it. Additionally, it said that 3 successive purchasers of a field combined to create an acquisition from the original owner, so long as it was all actually written down in deeds. It additionally qualifies this point. New Mishnah. Some people, as they typically have access to other people's property, cannot establish an acquisition of it by living there for a while. This includes craftsmen, partners, sharecroppers, and administrators of property. A man cannot create an acquisition of his wife's property, nor vice versa, nor can a father towards his son, nor vice versa. This applies to the establishment of an acquisition to prove ownership of a property. There would be a valid acquisition if it was given as a gift, or divided between brothers, or taken from a deceased convert, as once this man locks, fences, or breaches the property to any extent, he acquires it in full. The Gemara says there are variants of this discussion, one of which excludes a partner from those who cannot establish a property acquisition. Some say this opinion only allows it when the partner occupies the entire field. Others say it's only where he occupies half the field. Alternatively, it's where the partner occupies the entire field and the partner can only acquire the field if it's large enough to be subject to legal division. This is additionally discussed. He also says the partners can testify on behalf of each other. This is specifically when a partner is testifying on a document that he's removing any of his claim to the field, so that way he should have no interest in whether the other man retains the land, so his testimony should be permissible. This principle is additionally clarified in a further debate if such a testimony is permitted. This is additionally discussed. There are further points. Additional point on whether certain testimonies can be accepted if the witness isn't involved but does not benefit from his testimony are discussed. Regarding the point that a craftsman can't acquire an item just by having held onto it, this is only where the item was initially given to the craftsman in the presence of witnesses. Others debate this notion. and it's additionally qualified. It actually brings a source which evidently disproves the point that witnesses are required for the deposit of the item by a craftsman for him to not be considered the owner. Related, it said if a person accidentally was given somebody else's utensils in a craftsman shop by the craftsman himself, he's allowed to use the utensils until the other man takes them back. This wouldn't apply in a mourner's house or in a feast, and would also only apply if the craftsman gave him an item, not your item. It debates some related cases. On the point of a sharecropper not establishing an acquisition, it's explained to be a generational sharecropper, so they're keeping the entire harvest over a period, so there's no visible difference when the acquisition period begins. However, if a generational sharecropper hired a different sharecropper who worked for 3 years, this would create an acquisition, as the owner would have protested if a new sharecropper had been installed on his property without his permission. If the sharecropper only apportioned some work to others, this would not create an acquisition, as it's possible he was made a supervisor, so he had authority to do so himself. It's also said that a sharecropper can testify on behalf of his employer, specifically where there are no fruits left in the field. It mentions some related principles on laws of testimony. Additionally, while a craftsman or sharecropper cannot acquire property by holding onto it for a long period, their sons can. A robber and his son, however, both cannot establish an acquisition, but the grandson of a robber can. This is qualified, and it mentions that a robber's grandson cannot acquire an item if it's from his grandfather's claim specifically. Some said the robber discussed here is one who has been established to have stolen a certain field. Others say it's only a family who are known to murder for financial gain. Also, a craftsman or a sharecropper can start acquiring items once they quit their job. A son can acquire from his father once he moves and sets up his own house, and a wife can acquire from her husband once she divorces. This is said to be stated to show it applies even with a questionable divorce, where the husband is still obligated to support his wife. Others say that if these men, the craftsman, sharecropper, etc., they actually can acquire the property if they bring additional proper proof that they own the property, although a robber cannot do this to acquire land, and he can only get his money refunded. Some say that if people force a man to sell an item, it's a valid sale. It debates at length as to what the source for this is. In the end, the rules that any forced sale is valid, even for a specific field. It is, however, said a forced betrothal is invalid, as the rabbis could retroactively invalidate it, as was discussed more in Tractate Kedushin. Some related incidents are brought. These are discussed. It was said that a husband cannot create an acquisition of his wife's field by living there for a period. It's said that possibly him bringing proof of acquisition could be invalid, as she could claim that she had only given it to make her husband happy, as seen in some other cases. However, others say that such a concept would only apply to fields that are specifically assigned to payment in the marriage contract, either specified in the contract, stated orally, or brought by her into the marriage as assessed property. It additionally debates this point. It was said that a woman must protest against others trying to acquire her property, which can only really be her husband that's doing this, but this doesn't show a man can theoretically acquire his wife's property, as it's referring to the wife protesting against her husband changing the structure of her property by digging pits in it and similar. This is qualified. Others say the woman isn't protesting against the husband, it's against somebody else, and it's a case where the man used the property while the husband was alive, and then also for 3 years after the husband's death, meaning if the man wanted to, he could claim that he had purchased the land directly from her or from her husband after she had sold it to her husband. Some say that while people cannot establish an acquisition from the property of a married woman, the judges of the diaspora could. Additionally, when we say that a wife cannot acquire property from her husband, this is referring to when the husband had designated a section of land for her food. This would apply unless the woman had a document proving it was a gift. This principle is additionally discussed. There are further points, but the law is said to be that if somebody sells a field to his wife, she does not acquire it, and the husband would receive the produce so long as the money is not hidden. If it was given to her as a gift, she would receive it, and the husband would not receive produce. Related, it said deposits are not accepted from married women, Canaanite slaves, or from small children, but if you did accept, it should be returned, although by the child, a trust should be set up, and if the person had died, it should be returned to their husband, master, or heirs. If, when any of them died, they said the deposited item belongs to somebody else, he should return it to them, and if the custodian doesn't believe the person, it should be returned to the husband or master. Regarding making the trust for a child, this is defined either as buying a Torah scroll so the boy can study, or getting a palm tree which the boy can eat from. It's ruled, if a father and son are separated, the son being financially independent, they can acquire from each other. There are related points which are then qualified. Back to the earlier point, it was said a gift, or brothers that divide the property, or fencing, locking, or breaching property, etc., can acquire the property, as there's no challenge to them doing so. It additionally defines these latter cases, saying that breaching a fence and similar is valid if done even a little bit, such as widening a breach just enough that it can be entered or exited through. This case is described further. Other methods of proprietary acts are mentioned. Benefiting some land by placing or removing a stone to seal or unseal water could function. Related, if there are two ownerless fields with a single boundary between them and somebody does a proprietary act in one, he only acquires that field, not the other one. If the man's intent was to acquire both fields and the boundary, it's unresolved if this is effective. It's also unresolved if he does a proprietary act in the boundary divider. There are additionally described rules of proprietary acts. For example, if somebody built a mansion on ownerless property from a deceased convert and somebody else installs the door, the second man would acquire it, as that's the significant act. Similarly, if somebody plasters the wall of a mansion built on ownerless property the size of a square cubit, although some say it must be opposite the doorway, he would acquire the property. It's also said if somebody spreads out mats over ownerless property, he acquires it, and it gives sources from other cases. If somebody throws a turnip into a hole on such ownerless property, he does not acquire it, because that does nothing, and then when the turnip grows, that's doing so on its own. It's also said if somebody removes branches from a tree, he acquires it if it was done to improve the tree, such as by doing it on all sides. Similarly, if somebody swept debris from land, he acquires it if it was to improve the land, seen if he removed both small and large pieces of wood. Or if somebody levels the dirt in some land, he acquires it if it was to improve the land, which would be seen if he took dirt from heaps and deposited it into holes to level everything fully. Or if somebody opens some land to let water run through, he acquires the land if it was to irrigate the field, which is seen if he also makes an exit. Examples are brought. It's also said you can acquire ownerless property from a deceased convert by drawing a picture on a wall. Additional similar examples are brought if a non-Jewish man sells property to a Jewish man after the money is given, but before the Jewish man receives the deed, the property is temporarily ownerless and can be claimed by anybody through a proprietary act. Others debate this, and it brings some incidents. These are additionally discussed, and there are some related points on tax law, and also discussed some laws of tithes. These are additionally discussed, and it mentions the boundaries of the area included in the laws of tithes, which it defines as excluding the regions of Mount Seir, Ammon, and Moab, otherwise known as Damascus, Asia Minor, and Aspamia. New Mishnah. If two witnesses testify that a person used a property for 3 years, and the witnesses are found to be false, they need to repay the original owner everything. If two witnesses testify to the first year's use, two witnesses testify to the second year's use, and then two witnesses testify for the last year's use, and they're found to be false, the penalty would be divided between them. If three brothers testify each for 1 year along with an unrelated witness, these are considered to be separate testimonies and are valid. However, they would be considered as one testimony if they're proven false. The Gemara cites the source of this opinion. Other similar cases are cited, which are then discussed. New Mishnah. An acquisition cannot be established through placing animals in somebody's courtyard, placing an oven, millstone, or stove, raising chickens, or by depositing manure into the courtyard. An acquisition can be established by making 10 handbreadth high partitions for an animal within, or by making the partition for the oven or millstone, or by bringing chickens into the house, or by placing the manure somewhere 3 handbreadths deep or 3 handbreadths high. The Gemara explains essentially that these acquisitional acts work as they're done by a partner in the backyard of his jointly owned property. As placing an animal there is not an issue, but the other partner would object to a partition being placed, which resolves a contradiction with a different Mishnah. There are other solutions recommended. It's also said that a partner can prevent the other from doing most tasks in a jointly owned courtyard besides for washing clothes, as it was immodest to do laundry in public and a person should not watch such a thing. There are related teachings on the proper, modest ways of a Torah scholar, how they should dress, how they should set their table, and similar. There's this story, a certain sage would go around and mark crypts, so that way people wouldn't accidentally become impure. He came to the crypt of Avraham, the forefather, and saw his servant Eliezer outside. He asked Eliezer what Avraham was doing, and he said that Avraham was laying in the arms of his wife. So he went inside, took some measurements of the cave, and left. A voice from heaven said, "Well, you were there, you also saw the forefather Jacob, but you should make sure to not look at Adam." But the voice described the remaining dimensions, so that way he wouldn't need to go back in. The sage said that he had seen the heels of Adam, and said that they resembled two sons. It also describes the great beauty of Adam, comparing him to the other forefathers. Another story, a magician would go around to the dead and rob their graves. He did so to one past sage, and the sage grabbed his beard and wouldn't release him, so another sage had to come and free the man by cutting off his beard. There are other stories involving these sages. New Mishnah. Other items, placing a drain spout in somebody's property does not create an acquisition, but it's place wood, which will be explained. A gutter could create an acquisition. An Egyptian ladder cannot create an acquisition, while a Tyrian ladder can. An Egyptian window, which is one too small for somebody's head to enter, cannot create an acquisition, but a Tyrian window can. Others say the Egyptian window also can. I'm going to get some suggestions as to what the drain spout's place creating an acquisition means. It could be the establishment allowing somebody to place their drain spout on either side of a gutter. Others say it means that a drain spout can be shortened but not removed. Others say that it means you could build beneath the drain spout but not remove it fully. The gutter there would be different than the drain spout, as a gutter would be made of stone. The remaining points are clarified. For instance, an Egyptian ladder is defined as a small one with less than 4 rungs, and there are additional disputes cited. New Mishnah. A beam that protrudes into a neighbor's courtyard at least a handbreadth has an acquisition if left for 3 years, meaning it cannot be removed. The courtyard owner can protest its initial placement. There's no acquisition and no permissibility to protest if it extends less than a handbreadth in. The Guarantors says if somebody establishes an acquisition of a beam at 1 handbreadth by 4 handbreadths, the acquisition becomes one of 4 by 4 handbreadths. Regarding the point that you cannot protest if the beam is less than a handbreadth, it's a debate as to who exactly is protesting against who in this case. This is described. New Mishnah. A person cannot open windows of his house if they open into a jointly owned courtyard. If somebody owns a house in one courtyard, he cannot open a door leading to another jointly owned courtyard, as this could increase the traffic flow. Similarly, if somebody adds an attic to his house, he cannot open the attic to a jointly owned courtyard, but he can build a room inside his house or an attic on his house that opens into his own house. The Gemara says this obviously includes a prohibition against opening a window into a separate neighbor's courtyard, and as mentioned, the jointly owned courtyard also. It's a debate if opening windows onto a jointly owned courtyard establishes a permissibility to do so. If somebody builds a wall in front of somebody's window and they don't protest, this establishes a permissibility to do so. It explains the issues with opening doors to other courtyards, being that it increases traffic. New Mishnah. On the topic of privacy concerns, within a jointly owned courtyard, you cannot open a doorway opposite a doorway or a window opposite a window. If there was a doorway or a window, it cannot be enlarged or made into 2. Within a public domain, a doorway can be opened opposite a doorway or a window opposite a window, and they can be enlarged or made into 2. The Gemara brings the scriptural sources for this principle. Additionally, debates as to what exactly is impermissible by enlarging or dividing a window. These concerns do not apply within a public domain, as everything happening in the house is open to the public domain anyways, so there's not much concern as to what the neighbors are saying. New Mishnah. It's impermissible to dig pits or similar beneath a public domain. Others say it's fine so long as the cover is strong enough to hold a wagon laden with stones. It's impermissible to extend balconies or similar from your wall into the public domain. However, you can pull back your own house and then build a balcony. If somebody had purchased a house that already had a balcony extending into the public domain, he can keep it. The Gemara says the reason one opinion forbade digging at all beneath the public domain is in case the covering that he's going to end up installing ends up rotting. Some particular cases are brought and discussed. In the event somebody pulls his own house back in and decides not to build out his balcony, it's a debate if he can extend them out at a later date. Others say it's a debate if he can actually return the wall to its original place. It was said if somebody purchases a house with overextending balconies, he can keep it. It was also said that if it ends up collapsing, he can rebuild it as it was with the balcony extended. It mentions some later points. After the destruction of the temple, many Jewish people wanted to stop eating meat or drinking wine out of mourning, as this was part of the temple offerings, but this was said to be wrong, as then you'd also need to stop eating bread, fruits, or water, which were also part of other offerings. Instead, it was said a person should leave part of his house unplastered, and if making a meal, part of it should be left out, and if a woman is adorning herself, she should omit one part. Scriptural sources for this concept are brought. It's also said that there's a great merit to mourning for the second temple, and those that do so will merit to see the rebuilding of Jerusalem, and also that technically it would be proper, as there were severe decrees in those days against learning Torah, against circumcision, and similar, to stop having children. But it was said to persist anyways, and that it was better to unintentionally violate those commandments than to deliberately violate the commandments by not having children. And that's the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Tractate Bava Basra begins discussion on the laws of sales, particularly what's included within the sale of particular items. The first mission says, if somebody sells a house, then a side attached house called an annex is not included in the sale, even if it opens into the actual house. The storeroom in the back is also excluded from the sale, and the roof is excluded if it has a 10 handbreadth high wall around it. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees and says if the roof has a doorway to access the house, no matter the size of the wall, it's not sold. The Gemara says there's a debate if the word used to say an annex translates to an annex or to a veranda, which is a type of open-air porch. If it means an annex, the veranda would definitely also be excluded, while if it means a veranda, the annex would be included. It gives some additional terminologies that can be used to say an annex. Some say an annex less than 4 square cubits would actually include it in a house sale. Others disagree, saying the same does not apply by a pit. But it's said to not be comparable, as a house and a pit have completely different functions, while a house and an annex have the same function. Stating that the storeroom is excluded from the sale of the house is to show that this applies even if it's within the general described boundaries of the house. It quotes similar rulings to this by a house and also by a field. For instance, it said if somebody is selling a particular field, it does not include anything further than it, even if it's seen in the specified boundaries, as it's possible that the boundaries were exaggerated slightly out of convenience. This notion that the drawn border doesn't strictly specify the sale is as land has the same function everywhere, unlike houses which have very precise boundaries. The source of this opinion is cited. A case is brought, somebody said to another that he's selling the land of the house of Chia. Now, there were 2 pieces of property with that title, but it was ruled the man only got one of them, as he was being sold land in singular. If somebody is selling lands, plural, the buyer would receive a minimum of 2. If the seller said he's selling all the land, he sells all of the lands that he owns, but no gardens or vineyards. If the seller says he's selling zehara, which means all cultivated lands, he sells all of his land, including gardens or vineyards, but excluding his houses or slaves. If he says he's selling his property, then this would include his house or slaves. If the seller marked the boundaries to define the property and drew one line longer than the other, like this, some said the buyer gets up to the shorter line, but it was held that they actually just connect the diagonals. In fact, the former opinion would agree it's connected to the diagonals if the 4 fields on the sides are owned by 4 different people. Additionally, if somebody wants to sell a field with a north and south border owned by one man, and an east and west border owned by a different man, then the ownership of the boundaries must be specified in the document. It's asked, what if the seller only specified the owners of the field at the 4 corners? And also, what if the seller drew 2 L shapes in the 2 corners? How is the boundary divided? And also, what if the seller only mentioned every other bordering field, like so? And all of these are unresolved. If 3 of the boundaries of a field are specified, some say the buyer acquires everything but a strip of land by the 4th border, others say he acquires the whole field, and others say he only acquires the literal specified border. It said we hold like the first opinion, although only if the excess strip extends past the specified parallel lines. If it's between them, it would be included. Additionally, if it does extend past, it's only excluded if there are planted palm trees or if it's large enough to plant 9 kav of seeds in that location, meaning it's significant enough to be retained by its owner. There are other versions of this discussed. Additionally, it said if the seller writes that he's selling half that I own in the land, the buyer gets half the land. But if the seller says he's selling half in the land that I own, the buyer gets a quarter. Others disagreed and said there's no difference. Another debate, if the boundary of the sold land is defined as being something that divides, the buyer gets half the land. If the word cut off is used, the buyer gets land large enough to plant 9 kav of seeds. Again, others debated this difference. Additionally, it said that if somebody says he's giving a share of his property, it's defined as giving at least a quarter. There is related discussion on this by laws of tithe stipulations. This is additionally discussed. It's also said that if somebody is selling a house, he must specifically say he's selling from the depth of the earth to the height of the sky to include any pits or cisterns in the sale. Just saying that he's selling the depth and the height would be insufficient, as that includes only the space below and above the house, as will be mentioned very soon. It additionally debates this set of definitions. New Mishnah. A house's pit and cistern are not included in the sale of a house, even if the seller wrote that he's including the house's depth and height. Rabbi Akiva says that the seller must purchase a right-of-way to his cistern, unless the lack of the sale of this path is specified. The sages say he automatically retains it. Automatically, if the seller sold the pit or cistern, Rabbi Akiva says the buyer automatically gets the right-of-way to the pit or cistern, while the sages say he must purchase it separately. The Gemara explains the difference between a pit and a cistern, which is that a cistern is one reinforced with stone. The debate between Rabbi Akiva and the sages is essentially as that Rabbi Akiva holds that a person sells things in a more generous manner, liberally essentially, while the sages disagree and say that people typically sell in lesser amounts. The sources for these opinions are debated, and it proves this argument from other cases. It is, however, ruled that a person typically sells in lesser amounts. There is further argument on the basis of this dispute. Others actually do hold the opinion to be like Rabbi Akiva, that people typically sell generously. Related, it said that if there are 2 rooms, one inside the other, and they're both sold or given as gifts simultaneously, then neither buyer has the right of way through the other man's property. And this also applies if the outer room was gifted and the inner room was sold. However, if the case is when the outer room was sold and the inner room was gifted, people typically give gifts more generously, so the right of way through the outer apartment would be granted. New Mishnah. Somebody who sells a house includes the door but not the key. It includes the attached ground mortar but not movable mortar. It includes the mill ring but not the mill hopper, which was a detachable part, and the oven and stove are excluded. However, if the seller said he's selling the house and everything contained inside, then all of these objects would be sold. The Gemara cites the source for these opinions. There's a quote that says very similarly to ours, although Rabbi Eliezer disagrees, and he says that anything attached to the ground is considered to be a part of the ground, meaning according to him, a mortar that was carved before being attached to the ground is considered to be a part of the ground, and is sold along with the house. The prior opinion disagrees. The same principle about the status of a vessel attached to the ground is also debated by some laws of the mikvah. This is additionally discussed, and there are further points in the laws of ritual impurity. It's additionally debated as to whether a mill ring is classified as land from some additional cases. New Mishnah. Somebody selling a courtyard includes the house, pits, ditches, and vaults within the sale. Movable items within the courtyard are not included. If the seller said he's selling the courtyard and everything contained inside, everything is included, including the movable property. However, whether or not this is specified, a bathhouse or an olive press within are not included in the sale. Rabbi Eliezer disagrees and holds that if somebody sells a courtyard, he's only sold its open areas and nothing else. The Gemara says one source says that shops open to the courtyard and to the street are included in the sale of the courtyard, specifically if most of the shop's business is from inside the yard. Otherwise, it's not included in the sale. Related, it said that Rabbi Eliezer would agree that the houses in a courtyard are sold if the sale used the word dirsa, which specifically includes the houses. They would disagree if the word dirta was used, which possibly only refers to the yard. Others say they'd agree by dirta that the houses are included, but they debate by the word chatzir, which most probably refers to only the courtyard areas. Related, it said if a person sells a land, field, and a riverbed, doing the proprietary act on only one does not acquire the other. There's variation on this. Some say it's the exact opposite, that doing the proprietary act on one acquires also the other in spite of the fact that they have different functions. New Mishnah, if somebody sells the building of an olive press, he includes some parts of the olive press, being the vat, a mortar, and the supporting beam. He does not get the boards placed on top of the olives, or the screw that raises the beam, or the actual beam that crushes the olives. But if the man specified that he's selling everything inside, all of this is included in the sale. Rabbi Eliezer disagrees and says that if an olive press building is sold, it includes the crushing beam. The Gemara spent some time defining all of these different parts of an olive press and quotes a similar dispute as to what's included in the sale. New Mishnah, if somebody sells a bathhouse, it does not include the boards, basin, or bathing apparel. If the seller sold the bathhouse and everything it contains, those items would be sold. However, either way, the water reservoirs and the woodshed are excluded from the sale. The Gemara clarifies other things included in the bathhouse sale: the towel closet, but not the towels, the basin closet, but not the basins, etc. Related incidents are cited. New Mishnah, if somebody sold a town, it includes the houses, pits, ditches, vaults, bathhouses, dovecots, olive presses, and any gardens, but it excludes any movable property. If the seller said he's selling the town and everything contained inside, it includes everything, even any animals or slaves within at the time of sale. Some say if somebody sells a town, that includes even the santer, which will be defined in a minute. The Gemara gets into a debate as to whether slaves are considered to be movable property. Anyways, some define a santer as the town clerk, others say it means the directly surrounding fields. If it's a clerk, then the surrounding fields are definitely also sold, but not vice versa. It debates this definition further. This is additionally discussed. Additionally, it said animal, birds, or fish enclosures are included in the sale if they open inwards towards the town, but if they open outwards, they would not be included. New Mishnah. If somebody sells a field, this includes the stones that are in use, the reeds that are in use by a vineyard, and any produce attached to the ground, and also reeds that cover an area less than a quarter kav, and also a watchman's hut if it's not plastered with clay, and also an ungrafted carob tree, and also a virgin sycamore tree. Excluded from the sale are stones that are not in use, reeds that are not in use for the vineyard, and produce detached from the ground. Although these would be included if the sale has said he's selling the field and everything contained within. However, either way, what's never included is an area of reeds that cover at least a quarter kav, a watchman's hut if it's been plastered with clay, a grafted carob tree, and a trimmed sycamore tree. The Gemara explains stones that are used in a field are possibly stones used to weigh down cut grain, possibly stones arranged for building a fence. Either way, there's a debate if they're designated from being prepared or from being placed down. The use of reeds was to place smoothed reeds under grapevines to keep them off the ground. Again, there's a debate if it's from when they're prepared for use or from when they're placed. Additionally, grain is sold along with the field even if it's ready to be cut. An area of reeds less than a quarter kav is included in the sale even if they're strong, and an unplastered watchman's hut is sold even if it's attached to the ground. As for the status of the doorstep of a house, if it's attached with pegs, the status of window moldings attached with pegs, and the status of blocks beneath legs of beds if they're unattached, as to if they're included in the sale, all of those go unresolved. Grafted carob trees are not included in the sale even if they're thin. Sources are quoted. There are related points on what must be specified in a sale of trees or property for trees. These principles with carob trees and sycamore trees as to what is and is not included in the sale of a field is further qualified. Anyways, it said if somebody deposited an item with somebody for safekeeping and recorded this on a document and then the guardian claims he already returned it, it said the guardian is believed if he takes an oath. It additionally disputes this case. New Mishnah. Somebody who sells a field has not sold the pit, the winepress, or the dovecot within, whether they're being used or not. Rabbi Akiva holds the seller needs to buy back his right of way to access these locations. The sages say he doesn't need to, he retains the path to them. Rabbi Akiva would say he does not need to buy the paths if he specifically says he's selling the field besides for these items. If the seller sold the items, the pit, the winepress, etc., and kept the field, Rabbi Akiva would say the buyer does not need to buy the right of way. The sages would disagree. If, however, the item in question was given as a gift, it's agreed that it's probably given including the path to access it. Related, If brothers are dividing an inheritance and they acquire a field, all of those items, the pit, the winepress, etc., are included in this acquisition. If somebody claims the estate of a deceased convert through a proprietary act, this includes these extra items. If somebody consecrated a field, it includes these items. Others disagree and say everything extra is excluded, save for grafted carob trees or cut sycamore trees. The Gemara explains a gift is unique, as you should have specified that the extra items are included in said gift. Related incidents are cited. It said if somebody sells a piece of land and retains 2 trees within, he also keeps the land beneath them. This would even possibly apply like Rabbi Akiva, who says a person typically sells generously, as mentioned, as the trees are bad for the surrounding soil. This point is actually disproven, and is explained based on other discussions that this opinion cannot hold in accordance with Rabbi Akiva. This principle is additionally discussed. There are further points on the topic of grafted carob trees and cut sycamore trees. They have the status of trees in that if they're consecrated or sold, 2 plus 1 of these, the recipient gets land along with the trees. It also has a similar status to land in that it's not typically sold along with land. Similar in concept, a sheaf of grain with an amount of 2 se'ah of wheat has the status of a sheaf, in that 2 forgotten sheaves must be left for the poor, but 2 forgotten sheaves plus 1 of these larger ones don't need to be left for the poor. But it also has the status of a stack, in that 1 of these larger sheaves does not need to be left for the poor. Anyways, regarding a grafted carob or cut sycamore tree, it's a debate if they're consecrated along with the field between a few different opinions. And that's the end of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Tractate Bava Basra continues covering the various laws on the sale of immovable properties. The first Mishnah says, if somebody is selling a ship, this sale automatically includes the mast, the sail, the anchor, and everything else that drives the ship. This sale would not include any slaves that work on the ship, any sacks containing cargo, or the cargo itself. However, if the seller had specified he's selling that ship and everything inside of it, all of those things are included in the sale. The Gemara gives definition for the words for mast and sail and anchor. Anything that drives a ship here is defined as the oars, which is based on a scriptural verse. It also brings an expanded list of things that are sold along with the ship: the gangplank, the ship's water reservoir, some at the side, rowboat, which it also defines. Okay, the Gemara will now list about 21 different stories about a number of different topics, the first few of which are relevant as they relate to ships. Just about every single one of these stories are extremely fantastical and non-literal, and the commentaries explain at length as to what these are all analogy for, typically on esoteric subjects like God's relationship with man, the nature of the soul, and things along those lines. First story, there was a great ship-sinking wave in the ocean with a fringe of white fire, that if it was struck with a club that was engraved with the 3 names of God, it would subside. So just to explain this one, according to the commentaries, it's a metaphor for the soul's journey throughout the world, wherein it's antagonized by the evil inclination represented by the great wave, which has a white fringe, as on the surface it tries to portray itself as virtuous, and it could only be defeated through God's promises, represented by each of God's names. So that's one example. Next story, there are these great waves in the ocean, and one lifted some sailors so high they could see the resting place of the smallest star, which appeared to be absolutely massive, and if they had gone up any higher, the star's heat would have burnt them up. And then they heard the waves calling to each other when asking why this great wave wasn't destroying the world, and it answered that God had decreed that it couldn't even pass a thread breadth of sand at the seashore. Anyways, another story. A sage saw the demon Horman, son of Lilith, the mother of demons, who was riding along the battlements of the city of Mechoza, and a horseman was riding ahead of him on the ground, but the demon couldn't catch him. Also, 2 mules were saddled for this demon Horman, and were both standing on 2 bridges over a river, and the demon was jumping back and forth between the mules while pouring 2 full glasses of wine between each other without spilling a drop, and this summoned great storms, so the king of the demons sent his soldiers to kill Horman for giving up their secrets. By the way, this whole story here is explained to be a metaphor for the pointlessness of the pursuit of worldly pleasures. Another story, there was a great beast called a Re'im, the size of Mount Tabor. It describes its great size and says it excreted sufficient to dam the Jordan River. Another story, there was a frog the size of a city, which was swallowed by a sea monster, which was swallowed by a female raven, which then sat on a tree. Another story, some men were on a ship and they saw a fish which had a tiny creature crawl up its nostril, and then it died. The fish corpse washed up on shore, destroying a city, and the people there ate of it and built houses out of its bones to rebuild their city. Another story, people were on a ship and saw a massive fish that had an island growing on its back. So the men thought that it was a regular island, so they went up on it and started a fire, so the fish rolled over and they nearly drowned. Another story, some men were on a ship and traveled 3 days and 3 nights to travel between the 2 fins of a massive sea creature, even though their ship was going fast enough to outpace an arrow. Another story, some men were on a ship and they saw a bird's head sticking out of the water, so they assumed that the waters were shallow, but then a voice from heaven warned them that the water was so deep there and torrential that an axe dropped into that spot was falling through the ocean for 7 years and still hadn't hit the seafloor. Another story, men were in the desert and saw geese, which were extremely fat and rich, and they were said to be eaten by the righteous in the world to come, but due to the pain of the geese, those that delayed Mashiach's coming will be held accountable. Another story, an Arab merchant would be able to tell the distance and location anywhere in the desert just by taking some earth and smelling it. Another story, the Arab merchant brought the sages to see the location of Mount Sinai. On the way through the desert, they passed one of the corpses of the people from that time, and it was so massive that the merchant could travel underneath its bent knee while riding on a camel and holding a spear. One of the sages cut off a corner of the corpse's tzitzis, as there's a debate on the proper manner of its tying, but the merchant said he had to return it, or else they wouldn't be able to move on. Later, the sages all criticized him for not just counting the threads and knots on the tzitzis and recording it. Anyways, they reached Mount Sinai, and it was surrounded by scorpions resembling white donkeys. They heard a voice from heaven bemoaning the fact that God had chosen to take an oath to have the Jewish people put in exile, and the sages were later criticized for not taking the opportunity to annul the oath. Anyways, then this merchant led them to the grounds where the earth opened to swallow Korach and his followers. They saw smoke coming up from the ground, which burnt wet wool that was placed into the hole. The merchant reported that he had heard voices of the rebellion regarding their choices from that hole, and that Gehenna shakes them around every 30 days and brings them there. Anyways, then the merchant brought them to the place where the heaven and earth meet. They saw a window in the sky, and one of them put a basket in the window, and he went to pray, and then he saw his basket was gone. He was told that the heavenly sphere is rotating, and your basket will be back in place the next day. Another story, the sage reported that he was on a ship, and he saw a giant fish with eyes like 2 moons, and water pouring from its nostrils like 2 rivers. Another story, a sage reported seeing a great sea beast called the sea goat with horns, on which were engraved the words that it was only a small creature of the sea in spite of being 300 parsecs long, and it was going to be consumed by the Leviathan. Another story, the sage was on a ship and saw a chest covered with precious stones and pearls surrounded by dangerous sea creatures. One diver tried to get it, but he was attacked by the sea creatures, but he warded them off with a bottle of vinegar that he poured into the water. A voice from heaven declared that this chest was for the wife of the sage, Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa. Another story, a sage was on a ship and saw a precious stone surrounded by a massive sea monster which attacked the ship, but then a great raven cut off the head of the sea monster and so much blood came out that the water turned to blood. Then another sea monster came and placed the stone back around the dead sea monster, and then it came back to life, but it was then re-killed by the raven. So the men on the ship grabbed the stone, and it was placed onto some salted birds, which then came back to life and flew off with the stone. Another story, some sages were traveling by ship, and one started getting afraid, and said he saw a great light in the depths of the sea, and the other sage said that that was the eyes of the Leviathan. Another last story, a sage was in the desert, and he cut and prepared a piece of meat and placed on it some special herbs, but that repaired the meat back to its original shape. 12 months later, they returned and saw the coals from the fire were still glowing, as was a special type of wood. Anyways, some points on the Leviathan. There's a lot of commentary as to what the Leviathan even is. Some give it a more metaphorical meaning as some sort of an analogy, depending on the context. Here, it's apparently talking about a giant sea creature. Anyways, it said that there are 2 types of Leviathans, the straight snake and the curved snake, a male and a female, but to prevent them from reproducing and destroying the world, God killed the female and saved its meat for the righteous by Mashiach's coming, and castrated the male. God also created the behemoths, gigantic creatures, a male and a female, but to prevent them from reproducing and destroying the world, the male was castrated and the female was made unemotional. The female Leviathan was killed, as fish are more unconstrained, and it was specifically the female, as God plays with the Leviathan, and such a thing would be improper if he was doing so with the female. Again, a lot of commentary on what this is a metaphor for. The female behemoth was not killed, as only salted fish meat is good. It's also said, by the creation of the world, God ordered the angel of the sea to swallow up the waters to make room for dry land. The angel claimed it could not, so God killed it, and its carcass lays at the bottom of the ocean, and it can't be smelled due to the ocean above it. Some say that the Jordan River comes from the mouth of the Leviathan, and it lists a bunch of seas and rivers. It said, in the future, the angel Gabriel will lead a hunt against the Leviathan, and will only be able to defeat it with God's help. It further describes the massive size of the Leviathan, and that in the world to come the righteous will eat of the flesh of this Leviathan, and also that they'll live in structures made of its hide. If they're not fully worthy, they'll only get an amulet of its hide, and everything left over will be spread over the walls of Jerusalem. It's also said that Jerusalem will be built of massive gemstones when Mashiach comes. One student made fun of this, saying gemstones couldn't be that big, and then he was on a ship and he saw angels carving out massive gemstones for the future by Mashiach's coming. Then his teacher got upset at the student, looked at him, and the student turned into a pile of bones. These points on the reward by Mashiach's coming are further described and related. It said that there are three who are referred to by God's name, being the righteous, Mashiach, and Jerusalem, as seen in a few verses. It's also said that the righteous will be praised by the angels when Mashiach comes. It's also said that when Mashiach comes, the city of Jerusalem will be elevated up into the sky and will also be greatly increased in size. It also describes the great walls that will be built and additional points. Anyways, that's that. Back to laws of acquiring a ship. Acquiring an item is done here by pulling it, or drawing it, to some extent. By a ship, it's a debate as to how much of this must be done. Some say even a small amount, others say it must be actually moved to a new location. There's a related debate on how much is necessary to acquire an animal. There's also an argument that the ship can be acquired by a document. Regarding the ship, it's argued as to where it's located, as it's implied elsewhere that acquiring an item via pulling it inside of a public thoroughfare is ineffective. So some explain the case to be is where the boat is being taken from a public domain into a recessed area off to the side, or if the ship is in its owner's domain, it can be acquired by just having its place rented. In fact, if the seller told the buyer to pull the ship to acquire it, and the buyer only held the rope, some say he needs to actually pull the ship, others say the seller was just giving him an example and what he did was sufficient. There are related points on the acquisition of promissory notes. Simply, it's that the law is that letters, meaning notes of indebtedness, can be acquired through handing it over, and it doesn't need a document to acquire it, as it's explained that letters are words, and words cannot be acquired with just words. Others debate this, and it's discussed further. New Mishnah. If somebody sold a wagon to another, this does not include the mules. If somebody sold mules, this does not include the wagon. If somebody sold a yoke, this does not include the oxen. If somebody sold oxen, this does not include the yoke. Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that it could go according to the purchase price, meaning that if somebody bought a yoke for 200 zuz, this obviously includes the oxen. The sages disagree. The Gemara says if somebody sold a wagon, it actually would include the mules if they were hitched to the wagon at the time of sale. Additionally, regarding the debate between Rabbi Yehuda and the sages as to if what's included in the purchase can be concluded from the cost, it's explained to be where in the locale oxen are also referred to as yoke by some people. Additionally, according to the sages, you say that the oxen are not included in this massive charge. Possibly the sale is entirely void due to the overcharge, or possibly it couldn't be allowed as the overcharge is so unreasonably high. The fact that the buyer is still accepting this purchase shows that he's giving the excess as a gift. New Mishnah. There's a debate if selling a donkey includes the gear. Some say yes, some say no, some say sometimes it's dependent on if the gear is on the donkey, and the buyer said, sell me this donkey of yours, where the gear would be included, or if he said, sell me it, your donkey, where the gear would not be included. The Gemara debates as to what this referenced gear exactly is. Some say the sack, saddlebag, and side saddle. And the debate, if it's included, is as to whether a donkey is used for riding or for carrying cargo. Based on this, according to both, the saddle, blanket, breast strap, and similar would be included in the sale. Others disagree with this set of definitions. It's debated further. A number of sages hold that when something is sold, its accessories are included. Anyways, the difference between specifying sell me this donkey of yours and sell me it, your donkey, is in the first case he said this donkey, apparently including the gear. New Mishnah. If somebody sells a donkey, it includes its foal. If somebody sells a cow, it does not include its calf. If somebody sold a dump, it includes the manure. If somebody sold a pit, it includes its waters. If somebody sold a beehive, it includes the bees. If somebody sold a dovecote, it includes the doves. The Gemara explains the difference between selling a donkey and a cow as to whether its child is included is if he said he's selling a nursing cow or donkey, as a cow could just be sold on loan for its milk, but this does not apply by a donkey. It discusses some related verses on this topic, speaking about how poor it is to be a haughty individual. It also speaks about the great negativity of straying from the words of Torah. Anyways, we have stated that if somebody sells a dump, it includes its manure with the sale related. It said that if somebody consecrated, for instance, a pit filled with water, or a dump filled with manure, or a dovecote filled with doves, etc., both the item and what they contain are consecrated to the temple, and can no longer be used for personal benefit. But if the pit itself was consecrated and only later became filled with water, or the same with the other cases, or a tree was consecrated and only later grew fruit, some say the secondary items are not consecrated, while others disagree by the growth of a field or a tree, saying they are actually included in the consecration, even if they weren't there initially. It discusses this dispute in some related cases. Others reverse the issue, saying both opinions agree that a tree or a field and their later grown produce are both included in initial consecration, and the debate is by a pit or a dovecote if their waters or doves are included in this consecration. It's explained, when the pit was empty at the time of consecration, the debate is based on a different argument as to whether somebody can transfer an item that doesn't yet exist. Also, this would only apply if the water or doves came from the consecrator's own property. They also debate if the pit or a dovecote was full when the consecration occurred, is where they didn't specify what the consecration included, and it's a dispute if the water or doves are included, based on if this consecration is similar to laws of sales. New Mishnah. Somebody who purchases the rights of production of a dovecote from somebody must allow the first produced pair of doves to stay with their mother, as they're not included in the sale. Or if somebody purchases the rights of production of a beehive, the first 3 swarms must be cut off, which will be defined. If the buyer specifically purchased the hive's honeycomb, he must leave behind 2 combs. If he bought olive trees for lumber, he needs to leave 2 branches behind. The Gemara explains a pair of doves must be left with their mother, and if there is a daughter, a second pair must also be left. The daughter's pair must be of its own offspring, like so. The mother bird's pair is its mate and the daughter, and the daughter's pair must be its mate and its own daughter. This is necessary to leave the daughter bird's own heir to ensure the daughter bird stays. When we said that the first 3 swarms of bees from a hive must be cut off, some say this means to sterilize them by feeding them mustard, which causes them to return to their hive and stay there to eat honey. Others say cutting them off actually means to take alternating swarms, meaning the first, third, and 5th swarm, and to leave the rest of the cellar. Other sources say to take the first 3 and then take every other one. Regarding honey in a beehive by laws of impurity, it's said to always maintain the status of a food without needing anybody to be thinking about it as a food. Some say this excludes the first 2 combs we had mentioned that are set aside, as those are not intended to be eaten. Others disagree with this status as food entirely. The status is additionally discussed regarding types of honey and laws of impurity, although a source does seem to confirm, like the original opinion, that honey in a beehive contracts food impurity without anybody needing to consider it as food. Anyways, we said if olive trees are being cut down, 2 branches must be left. Similar laws apply by other types of trees as to how much of a stump must be left over for it to regrow. For instance, it said a sycamore tree must have 3 handbreadths left over so it can regrow, as this allows it to grow back. Raising it to the ground would be negative for it, and leaving anything higher than this would be neither negative or positive. So by laws of the sabbatical year, this tree can be raised down, but by buying and selling, as we're discussing, it must have 3 handbreadths left over to benefit the tree. It debates by other types of trees. It said that palms and cedar trees don't regenerate, which it debates from a few verses. It also defines a few other types of trees from scripture, New Mishnah. If somebody purchases 2 trees in somebody else's field, there's a debate if the man acquires any land in addition. For those that say he does not, if the branches grow over the seller's land, the seller cannot trim them, but the seller can cut any offshoots from the trees. If the tree dies, the buyer would still have no rights to the land. Anyways, however, if somebody purchased 3 trees, it's agreed that the buyer does acquire some land, meaning the seller can actually trim them a bit if they extend over his property. Anything that grows from the trunk or root belong to the owner, and if the trees die, the buyer has the right to the land to replant them. The Gemara says, elsewhere there's a very similar debate by purchasing 2 trees as to if the land is included by laws of Bikurim, first fruit tithes, as again, some say that the land is also purchased, and therefore blessings must be said by this tithe. This would be necessary to say again over there to show this opinion holds that saying the blessings by the Bikurim tithe applies even if somebody buys these first fruits from the marketplace. Others dispute this opinion, quoting some verses and additional sources, and from the latter it proves the inverse, that actually this opinion holds that to say the blessings on the Bikurim tithes, you actually do need to own the land. With these cases, the actual Bikurim tithe is still being brought as there's questionable ownership of the land. To be safe, though, in such a situation, the fruits should be additionally declared as consecrated before giving them to the Kohen to eat. Also, to be safe, they should be separately tithed, and there's no major concern about not saying the blessings, as those aren't strictly required. The blessings are just verses from the Torah, but they're not stated anyways, possibly as it has the appearance of falsehood, and possibly because then people will exempt them from other tithes. Anyways, by the tree on somebody's property, if the buyer doesn't get the land, he owns only the trunk and anything growing from it, not the roots. This is defined by whether or not it starts growing underground. Because of this, any branches near the base of the trunk should be removed, as there could be an argument as to whether the dirt covers them or not. Specifically by a date palm, the owner of the palm tree has no rights to anything growing from the trunk, as it doesn't typically produce any shoots from its trunk. Now, we said if somebody purchased 3 trees, he acquires land. This is defined here as the area immediately beneath the trees, the area between the trees, and also a circle around each tree large enough for a picker to stand with a basket to pick fruits. Now, some say if somebody buys more than 2 trees, so 3 trees, he does not also acquire a path through the field to these trees. So it's asked how, if he's not getting a path, he could get an additional surrounding area around each tree to pick fruits. So it's explained to be in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva that a seller sells generously, and the buyer can acquire this additional land while the seller can still trim the trees. It brings support for this opinion. There's a debate as to how much space there must be between each tree for this land acquisition to apply. Some say between 4 and 8 cubits, some say between 8 and 16 cubits. It argues this from some additional particular cases on various laws of fields, as to what constitutes a typical minimum distance between different types of of plants. Some actually say the trees can be between 4 and 16 cubits, and it brings sources for this. Also, the distance is measured from the middle of the trunk. Additionally, if somebody sells one tree that's connected underground but comes up in 3 separate places, appearing like 3 trees, based on a related case, they are considered to be separate trees. Although, if there were 2 trees in a field and a third on the boundary, or 2 trees in a field and a third in somebody else's field, that stands unresolved. Similarly, if a pit or an irrigation channel or a public path or similar cuts in between the trees, it goes unresolved. If a cedar tree grew between the trees before the sale, the land would still be acquired by the buyer. Now, there's this opinion that says the trees are arranged in a triangle. They would say if the trees are in a straight line, there's no land acquisition, as it's easy to cultivate the land between them, so the seller keeps it. Others disagree and say by a triangle formation or a straight formation, the buyer acquires the land. According to the former opinion, that it's only if the trees are in a triangle that the land is acquired by the buyer, as it would be difficult to cultivate by the seller. There is also a factor that the trees are significant, meaning if it was something like 3 thorn bushes that are being sold, the land between is difficult for the seller to cultivate, but they're not very significant, so the seller would still keep the land. New Mishnah: if somebody sells the head of a large animal, this does not include the legs. If somebody sold the legs, this does not include the head. If somebody sold the lungs, this does not include the liver. If somebody sold the liver, this does not include the lungs. However, by a small animal, if somebody sold the head, it includes the legs. If somebody sold the legs, it still doesn't include the head. If he sold the lungs, it includes the liver. If he sold the liver, it still doesn't include the lungs. Now, regarding somebody being sold an incorrect item, there are essentially 4 scenarios using the example of wheat. If somebody was told he's buying superior quality wheat and he finds it's inferior, the buyer can retract the sale. If somebody was told he's buying inferior wheat and he finds it's actually superior, the seller can retract the sale. If he was told it's superior wheat and it's actually superior wheat, neither can retract. If he was told he's buying red wheat and then finds it's white wheat, both of which have their own unique qualities, or vice versa, or for instance, he was buying olive wood and was given sycamore wood, or vice versa, or he was buying wine and he was given vinegar, or vice versa, either party can retract from the sale. The Gemara says, as support, it said if somebody buys an item worth 5 coins for 6 coins, and then it went up in value to 8 coins, the buyer was the person who was undercut initially, so only he can retract if he wants to. However, if the item was worth 6 coins, and it was sold for 5 coins, and then it dropped in value to 3 coins, the one who was undercut here initially was the seller, so here only he can retract the sale. This is all implied from our Mishnah. Anyways, based on the particular usage of words to reference wheat as white or red, the implication is that the sun itself, which has a similar used word, is actually red, and it's just difficult to tell due to our sight, and some say the sun is red-colored as it passes by Gehenna. Anyways, regarding the difference between wine and vinegar, some say there is no legal difference, but it's explained that that's only in regards to tithes. New Mishnah: if somebody sells produce to another, the man can acquire it through an acquisition via pulling it, without needing to measure it. Just measuring the item is insufficient to acquire it. If he wants, he can acquire the item by renting out its location. If somebody buys flax from another, he only acquires it once he moves it to a different location. If the flax was attached to the ground, all the buyer needs to do to acquire it is to detach any of it. The Gemara says, it's sufficient to acquire produce by measuring it and then placing it on the floor of a recessed area from the public domain. Others say it must actually be placed into the buyer's container, and it debates this. Related, it said that a person's utensil can acquire for him by having items placed within anywhere, besides for a public thoroughfare, but he can use a recessed area in a public domain. It's actually debated further if somebody's utensil can acquire for them in a public thoroughfare based on some further quoted cases, but it's unsuccessful in proving this. Now it's asked, if the buyer's utensil was in the seller's domain, can the utensil acquire items for the buyer? It tries to prove this from the case of somebody throwing a divorce document into a woman's sewing basket. This is a valid divorce, but as discussed back in Tractate Gittin, there's a few different interpretations of this case. Some say the basket was hanging from her, or tied to her, or otherwise, so it's not a viable proof. It additionally argues from further cases. Some additional further cases are brought. Now, it's said by some that real property, meaning land or houses, can be acquired via money, or a document, or a proprietary act. Movable properties, however, can only be acquired through pulling the item. Now, this is said to specifically apply by movable objects that are very heavy and cannot be lifted. If the movable item is small and light, some say it cannot be acquired by pulling, but it is acquired by lifting it. It argues this, citing a few relevant cases. These are discussed further. Anyways, it was said that if flax was attached to the ground, you could acquire all of it by uprooting a small amount. This is explained to be specifically where the seller told the buyer to improve a small amount of land and acquire whatever is on it. New Mishnah: if somebody was selling wine or oil to another and after the price was set, the price went up or down, if the price changed before the measure of the wine or oil was filled, the change in value goes on the seller. If the price changed after the wine or oil was filled, the change in value goes on the buyer. If there was a middleman between them and the barrel containing the wine or oil broke, then the loss goes on the middleman. Also, when somebody is buying wine or oil or a similar liquid When the seller empties his container into the buyer's barrel, he's obligated to keep pouring until 3 excess drops drip out. Any remaining residue in the container can be kept by the seller. This obligation to pour until excess drops drip out is said to not apply to storekeepers as they're busy. Similarly, some say that on Shabbos Eve by dusk, a person is not obligated to get the last drops out of a barrel he's selling. The Gemara debates as to who exactly owns the barrel that the wine is being poured into. It's said to be where it belongs to a third party, and the first case is where this third party is not present, and the second case is where he is present. Anyways, it was said that any remaining residue in the container after 3 drops are removed are retained by the seller. This is explained to be as the buyer abandoned ownership of this residue. The latter case, which said that there is an exemption to get drops out on Shabbos Eve, is referring still to a shopkeeper, meaning this opinion holds that that's the only time when a shopkeeper is exempt from this. New Mishnah. If somebody sends his minor son to the store to buy oil with a coin, and the storekeeper gave the child the oil and change, and on the way home the child broke the oil and lost the change, the storekeeper is held liable. Others disagree and say that as the father intended for the child to make his purchase, the father is held responsible. Although it is agreed that if the child is holding the flask as the storekeeper pours oil into it and the child drops it, the storekeeper is exempt from liability for the flask breaking. The Gemara says, those that hold the storekeeper is liable even though the father gave his child the breakable flask. It's a debate as to what the circumstance of this case is to make the father not be held liable. A few options are suggested and rejected. It's explained to be that the storekeeper took the flask from the child to measure it for other customers, effectively borrowing it without permission, and in such a case, the Mishnah's argument as to who is responsible makes sense, as the first opinion, that the storekeeper is liable, holds that he is considered to be a thief, while the second opinion, that the father is responsible, holds he's just considered to be borrowing the flask. Related, it said if somebody takes a utensil from a craftsman to inspect it and it breaks in his possession, he's liable. It said this only applies if the price is fixed, and some related incidents are cited. New Mishnah, somebody who sells on a wholesale must clean his measures every 30 days. A householder needs to clean them every 12 months. Others say it's the exact inverse, as if the weights are used more frequently, residue won't build up. A storekeeper must clean his measures twice a week, his weights once a week, and his scales every time they're weighed. Others say this only applies to wet produce and not to dry produce. A scale must always be tilted in the favor of the buyer by a handbreadth. If the scale is perfectly evenly balanced, it still needs to be tilted in favor of the buyer, 1 to 10 for wet produce and 1 to 20 for dry produce. If the custom is to measure produce with a small measure, a large one should not be used. If the custom is to use a large measure, a small one should not be used. If the custom is to level the measure, it shouldn't be heaped, and if the custom is to heap the measure, it shouldn't be leveled. The Gemara quotes sources for these principles and explains more precisely how much extra scales should be tilted in a buyer's favor. It also quotes many points on how terrible it is to use false scales and measures, being dishonest in business, comparing it to many other impermissible acts. A number of related verses on this topic are discussed, and some additional particularities on the proper process of using weights and being honest in business. The typical proper specifications of old scales are described, precise measurements, materials, and similar. These principles are additionally discussed. Also, what precise types of leveling utensils are used, what wood material, and related. It's also said that an imprecise scale cannot even be kept in your house, not even as something like a urinal. Precise measurements are additionally discussed and qualified. It's also said that people of a town should not increase the size of their measures more than a sixth, or to increase the value of their coins more than a sixth, or to overcharge for profit in a sale more than a sixth. It argues as to why, and it explains it's based on a verse. Some particular incidents are cited. It's also said to be extremely negative to hoard produce, to lend on interest, to cause prices to rise artificially, among others. It also speaks on some further points on assisting the poor, and it mentions that a person shouldn't hoard produce even from his own garden. The only time hoarding produce is permitted is on the year before, during, and after the sabbatical year, just not if there's a scarcity of produce. Again, there are further points on proper business practices, and there are some additional points on the story of Ruth, Boaz, and Naomi, and the related verses. It also speaks on Abraham, his life. It said that when he passed, all the great men of the world lined up to mourn him. Again, a number of other verses are quoted and spoken on. It speaks on the greatness of the produce of the land of Israel, and it also says that everything aged is better as long as it's typically something that's aged, so this excludes things like dates, beer, and small fish. And that's the end of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Tractate Bava Basra continues going through the various laws of sales. The first Mishnah says, if somebody sells produce to another without specifying if it was to be used for planting or for eating, and the buyer then planted it and it didn't grow, the seller is not held responsible for the loss, even if it's something that is typically used for planting. However, some add if the plant was something that could only be used for planting, like garden seeds, which are inedible, the seller is responsible for the loss. The Gemara quotes a related case. If somebody bought an ox and found it was a dangerous animal that gored people, there's a debate if the seller must refund him, based on whether or not the seller can claim that he sold the animal to be eaten, not for work. This case is clarified to be where the person typically buys oxen for either use, and also where the cost of the ox for meat and an ox for work is the same. So the difference as to who's liable is really as to who's responsible to dispose of the ox between the buyer or the seller. Essentially, the debate as to the status of the animal is as to whether the principle of majority applies. The first opinion said this purchase is undone, as majority of people buy oxen for plowing. The second opinion says the purchase stands, as he holds majority is not a followed principle within monetary law. It brings a series of different cases to try and prove like either opinion. Some additional cases are brought. Anyways, the Mishnah stated that if somebody sells a man defective garden seeds, he needs to repay him. Some say this is just the cost for the seeds. Some say he also needs to reimburse him for the expenses. It explains sources for these opinions. New Mishnah. If somebody sells grain to another man, the buyer automatically accepts a quarter kav per se'ah ratio of impurities within the grain. For figs, the ratio is 10 wormy figs out of every 100, or 1 for every 10. For a seller of wine, he accepts 10 soured barrels per 100, and from kegs from the region of Sharon, he accepts 10 poor quality ones for every 100. The Gemara says, when it says a quarter kav of impurities per se'ah of grain, this refers to legumes being mixed in, and it's not in reference to soil or dirt. It's debated exactly as to what a permissible ratio of dirt within would be. Additionally, some say that if a buyer is sifting through grain he's purchased, as there's an excess of impurities, he's allowed to sift through everything and return all impurities. Some explain this to be just his legal entitlement to return all of these impurities, more than just the extra if they exceed the permitted ratio. Others say it's actually a penalty, that if the impurities exceed the permitted ratio, he's now allowed to return all of the mixed impurities. It argues proofs and disproofs for this from several different discussions. These are additionally spoken on. There are further of these, but it winds up just being inconclusive. Anyways, it was said that within a sale of a seller of wine, a person accepts every 10 out of 100 to have gone bad. Now, if the seller had said he's selling a seller of wine, he'd be obligated to give only superior quality wine. And if the man said he's selling this seller of wine, he can sell souring wines. And if he said he's selling this seller, he's allowed to even sell vinegar. So it's explained the case must be that he sold a seller of wine, and it's amended that in such a case, there's still a permitted ratio of 10 poor quality barrels out of every 100. This would not apply if the sale was for a single barrel. Others debate this concept, and it's particularly qualified. For instance, if somebody said he's selling a cellar of wine for cooking, everything within must be of a superior quality. If he said he's selling this cellar of wine for cooking, all of the wine must be of superior quality, but the buyer also accepts every 10 out of 100 barrels as poor quality. If the seller said he's giving this cellar of wine and doesn't specify the use, he can give souring wine. If the seller said he's selling a cellar of wine without specifying the use, it's a debate as to if the buyer needs to accept a ratio of poor quality wine, which is discussed further. Also somewhat related, it was said in the very first Tractate Bava Basra, that the blessing on wine is boire piri hagafen. Some say this same blessing is also said on soured wine, others said instead the blessing shahakal should be said. Although it is agreed if it's extremely poor quality wine, like wine pressed from grape kernels, it has the blessing shahakal said on it. This debate is essentially as to whether souring wine is considered to be wine. It argues this from a case on the laws of tithes. It said that if somebody examined a barrel of wine and then finds that it's turned to vinegar, it said that all 3 days the barrel's contents are considered to be certain, and afterwards they're uncertain. There's a debate as to what this means. Some say that during the first 3 days since the first inspection, the barrel is assumed to have been wine, and from then until the next time the barrel was opened, it's considered to be vinegar. Afterwards, it has a doubtful status. This is as he holds that wine sours from the top downwards, and even if it had been about to turn to vinegar right after the first opening, he would have been able to tell from the smell. Others say that actually the last 3 days before it was opened the second time, it's assumed to be vinegar, and beforehand, it's uncertain. This is as this opinion holds that wine sours from the bottom up, which is qualified. A third opinion holds that the first 3 days after the first checking, it's definitely wine, and the last 3 days before the second checking, it's definitely vinegar, and in between, it's uncertain. And this opinion explains it specifically where the vinegar was extremely strong, meaning it agrees with the first opinion, but as the vinegar is very strong, it must have had turned to vinegar for a few days already. Anyways, it's still a debate as to if souring wine has the blessing of shahakal or hagafen stated over it. Related, it said if somebody sells a barrel of wine to another and it turned to vinegar, some say if this happened during the first 3 days of the sale, the wine is considered to have spoiled while under ownership of the seller, so the sale is invalid. Others say that the spoilage is entirely the fault of whoever owns it at the moment. If we follow the second opinion, it also qualifies the particular blessings on various other drinks, such as date beer, barley beer, and waters steeped with wine lees. All have the blessings of shahakal stated on them. This is more particularly qualified. Further regarding water steeped with wine lees, it's debated in regards to their tithing and consecration, and it's a general debate if such a substance is considered to be water or wine by these laws. Related, it said that on Shabbos, by the Kiddush blessing said over a cup of wine before the meal, The wine used should be wine fit to be used as a libation on the altar. It's argued as to what this excludes. It said grape juice is still allowed, mixed wine and water is not excluded, as that actually improves the wine. So rather, what it's excluding is wine that smells poorly or wine that was left uncovered, which cannot be used even if strained, as though there's no longer a health concern as it was strained. It's still improper. Also, it said it's proper to use red wine specifically. Anyways, when it ended by saying that purchasing kegs in Sharon, you accept 10 poor quality ones for every 100, this refers to ones that were cracked and resealed with sulfur. If they're not resealed, they don't need to be accepted at all. New Mishnah. If somebody sells wine to another and it sours, he's not responsible for the loss. If, however, it's known that the seller's wine sours, the sale is considered made in error and must be refunded. If the seller says he's selling flavorful wine, meaning wine that will last long, it must last until the holiday of Shavuos. If the seller said he's selling old wine, it must be at least a year old. If he says he's selling aged wine, it must be at least 3 years old. The Gemara says regarding responsibility being held with the seller for wine spoilage, this is explained to be if he transferred the wine to the buyer's cask, and also that the wine was specified as cooking wine. Others disagree, and as was briefly stated a bit earlier, they hold that wine spoilage is just the fault of whoever owns it at the moment. Some related verses are quoted. It's also stated if somebody sold a barrel of wine to a store to be used for a long period and it spoiled while there was still a half or a third remaining, the storekeeper can return this barrel. However, if the storekeeper changed the spigot or if market day had arrived, the seller is no longer responsible. There are similar points quoted. When it was said that the sale of aged wine must be from 3 years prior, it's added that the wine still cannot spoil until the following Sukkot holiday. New Mishnah. If somebody sells a lot to his fellow or accepts a contract on a lot from somebody to construct a wedding house for his son or a widowhood house for his daughter, some say it should be 4 by 6 cubits, others say this is way too small. If somebody wants to build a cattle barn, it should be 4 by 6 cubits. A small house should be 6 by 8 cubits. A large house should be 8 by 10 cubits. A tractate, which is a structure that will be defined, must be 10 by 10 cubits. All of these structures must have their heights be half their length plus half their width. It said this is similar to the construction of the sanctuary of the temple. The Gemara says the specification of a wedding house for a son and a widowhood house for a daughter is to teach us that it's not proper for a man to live in his father-in-law's house. It quotes some sources. It also debates who quoted the measurements of a cattle barn, and as for the tractate structure, it's said to be a pavilion that's adorned with roses. It's also said that a mansion courtyard is 12 by 12 cubits. Anyways, we said that the height of the structures was half the width plus half the length. Others disagree and say the height must be the same length as the roof beams, which is different than the width, as you have to account for perhaps the house widening near the top or for sockets that the beams extend into. Anyways, it also discusses the structure of the temple sanctuary along with how the cherubim, the cherubs on the ark, fit inside the room, accounting for the small dimensions, as they were simply a bit too small to fit according to the precise measurements that are given, so it said that they just stood miraculously. Now, some verses reference the cherubim as facing towards each other, and others reference them as facing away from each other. Some explain this, that when the Jewish people did God's will, they faced towards each other, and when they did not, they faced away from each other. Others just explained that they were positioned at an angle. New Mishnah. If somebody owns a water cistern inside somebody's house, he's allowed to enter and leave to get water only at a time that people typically do so. He cannot bring his animal inside. He would need to fill up a container to bring to his animal. And additionally, both the cistern owner and house owner make themselves a lock. The Gemara clarifies these two locks are both placed on the cistern. The house owner's lock is there so that the cistern owner won't enter without him being there, which could lead to suspicions of adultery with his wife. New Mishnah. If somebody owns a garden behind somebody else's garden, and he has a right of way through the others, he can only enter and leave at times that people typically do so. He cannot bring merchants into his garden to buy produce, nor can he use this just as a shortcut to enter into a different field. The owner of the outer garden can plant things in the path. That's if the garden path goes through the middle of the outer garden. If they agree to have the path off to the side of the garden, he can enter and leave whenever he wants. He can bring merchants into the garden, although he still cannot use it as a shortcut, and neither party can plant anything on the path. The Gemara says if somebody buys a canal through somebody's property for an irrigated field, the canal must be 2 cubits wide, along with an additional cubit on either side for the banks. If the canal was for a pond, it must be a cubit wide, with half a cubit on either side for the banks. Regarding these banks, some say the property owner can sow plants or trees in the banks, others say he can only plant trees, as seed roots would damage the earth and collapse the bank. Additionally, if a canal does collapse, it can be repaired with soil from that field, as that was a condition to have the canal go through that property. New Mishnah. If somebody had a public path passed through his field and he took it for himself and designated a new public path off to the side, then both paths are designated as public paths and he cannot undo this. The standard width of a private path is 4 cubits and the standard width of a public thoroughfare is 16 cubits. A king's thoroughfare and a path to a grave have no limit. The Ma'amad ceremony, which is done in return from a burial from a cemetery, as will be described, is done in an area of 4 kav. The Gemara says, a man cannot designate his path as the public thoroughfare in exchange for the current public path, as it was instituted that this is impermissible in case somebody tries to replace a public path with a crooked one. Alternatively, it's just that this specific case was where the man was actually trying to replace the public path with a crooked one. Alternatively, it's an issue with any type of path, as it could be you're moving it further away for some people. Additionally, it was said that if the man designated his path for the public, he cannot take it back. This is in accordance with the opinion that if the public chooses a path through somebody's field, it cannot be undone. This opinion is additionally qualified and sourced, saying that the public can acquire this path by walking through it. Others disagree, but they would agree that a path can be acquired via walking through a vineyard specifically, as that is intended for walking. The standard width of a path, if there are walls, is enough that a man can carry a load of branches on his shoulders and turn around in all directions without touching the borders. If there are no walls, the minimum width should be enough for a person to put one foot in front of the other. Anyways, we had stated that the standard width of a private path was 4 cubits. Others say it was actually wide enough for a donkey that's carrying things to walk through, which is a bit less than 2.5 cubits. It's also said the standard width of a path between cities is 8 cubits, a public thoroughfare, as mentioned, is 16 cubits, and a path to a city of refuge is 32 cubits, which is based on a verse. A king's path was said to have no limits, as he's allowed to even break through the fences of surrounding property to make a path. The path to a grave has no limit, to honor the dead with the funeral procession. Regarding the Ma'amad ceremony, which was essentially a series of eulogies given over on the path back from somebody's grave, it said no less than 7 of these are done, and some say it's only done in the actual cemetery. New Mishnah. If somebody sells a lot to somebody to make a catacomb, or somebody agrees to build a catacomb on his property, each crypt must be 4 by 6 cubits, and must have 8 recesses for the actual bodies, 3 on each side, and 2 in front. Each recess must be 4 cubits by 6 handbreadths, and 7 handbreadths tall. Others say the crypt must be 6 by 8 cubits with 13 recesses, 4 on the side, 3 in front, and 2 in the front diagonals. There must also be a courtyard built at the entrance to the crypt, 6 by 6 cubits, with enough space for the funeral bier and those carrying it. The courtyard must have 2 crypts opening into it. Others say it must have 4 crypts opening into it on all 4 sides. Others say it just depends on the type of rock the grounds are made of there. The Gemara says regarding the opinion that a standard crypt should have 13 recesses, it's argued how all of these could even fit. It's essentially explained that the inner corners are at slightly different heights, so that way they don't extend into each other. Alternatively, is that the case is regarding a crypt for stillborn children, so there's no concern of the recesses being large enough to touch each other. There are related points on burial crypt dimensions. Essentially, it's a debate as to what the status is if 3 corpses are unearthed in one spot, as to whether the middle corpse is considered existent in regard to registering the area as a graveyard zone. There's a similar case with the dimensions of a vineyard, with the opinion seemingly reversed as to whether the middle vines are considered to be existent in regards to considering the area as a vineyard. The switch is explained that unlike corpses, the extra vines will eventually be uprooted for firewood and can therefore be disregarded. And that's the end of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Tractate Bava Basra continues on the various laws of sales, now particularly on property sales. The first Mishnah says, if somebody sells a large area of earth, 75,000 square cubits, or a base kar as it was called, and there are clefts or rocks throughout, 10 handbreadths deep or high, they are not included in the measurement of the field, and the full amount of land must be provided from leveled ground. If they were under 10 handbreadths, it would be included in the field sale. If the seller said he's selling about this 75,000 cubits, then even clefts or rocks above 10 handbreadths are included in the sale. The Gemara brings a very similar principle regarding redeeming a consecrated field for coins, saying that clefts or rocks above 10 handbreadths are excluded. Some say specifically over there it's referring to clefts filled with water, as they're not fit for planting, so therefore are not subject to payment for redemption. This is explained to apply also by our Mishnah too, that the clefts are filled with water. But this still only applies if the clefts are over 10 handbreadths deep, as mentioned, as such a thing makes the plot of land as if it's separated into different plots. Also regarding the rocks, they're only excluded from the sale if they exceed an area of 4 kav. Some say this 4 kav of rocks must be distributed over 5 kav. Others say over a majority of the field. So if majority of the rocks are concentrated within a minority of the field, and a minority of the rocks are spread out over a majority of the field, that would stand unresolved. Anyways, if the rocks are arranged in a circle, in a straight line, or like horns, or in a zigzag, that's all unresolved. Also, if there's a single rock by a field's boundary or adjacent to it, even a very small one, it's not included in the sale of the field. If there was a small separation between the boundary and the rock, or if the rock was beneath the surface of the boundary, it stands unresolved. New Mishnah. If somebody is being sold 75,000 square cubits of earth, and it's a tiny bit smaller than this, as measured by a rope, the price must be reduced proportionately. If the land was a tiny bit larger than specified, it must be returned. However, if the seller said he's selling 75,000 square cubits, more or less, approximately, then the sale stands even if it's a bit more or a bit less. But if the sale was larger by a quarter kav per ursa'ah, the buyer needs to repay him extra with money, or if the seller prefers to just return the excess land. Money was said to be an option, so that way the seller won't just be left with a tiny useless plot of land. This is demonstrated from some scenarios. Also, if the person is returning the extra quarter kav per ursa'ah of land, he also would need to return all excess land, not just that amount. The Gemara debates the scenario if the seller said he's selling 75,000 cubits without specifying at all if it's an exact or approximate measure. It quotes a few discussions and proves that it's the equivalent of saying an approximate amount. Anyways, if there is a large amount of excess land, we said it could either be returned as money or as property. This is explained to be a decision that is made entirely by the seller, although if the price of the land was originally low and then went up, the seller can only demand payment from the original price. It additionally discusses some particular cases and asks a number of unresolved questions on these laws. New Mishnah. If a seller said he's returning land as measured by a rope, but then afterwards adds more or less, the second statement of more or less reduces the amount to be approximate. If he says the land's measurement, more or less, and then adds as measured by a rope, the second statement nullifies the first and makes the measurement precise. The Gemara says this Mishnah was just one opinion. Others completely disagree and say it's uncertain what we follow. A third opinion actually says that we follow whichever statement gives the buyer less. It's debated as to who agrees with which opinions. New Mishnah. If the seller sells a field and identifies it by the landmarks and boundaries, and the field was later found to be a different size, if the difference is less than a sixth, the buyer just gets the field without any adjustment. If the difference is greater than a sixth, there's a deduction made from the price. The Gemara says there's a debate if a deviation of exactly 1/6 is considered to be less or more than a sixth. This would create variation in the interpretation of the Mishnah, so it argues this from a few quoted cases. It disputes this along with a related discussion on some laws of inheritance. Additional particular cases on these principles are mentioned, although the laws of inheritance will be more clearly spoken on in the following chapter. For instance, if two brothers divide an inherited estate and a creditor from the father who had lent him money comes and takes from the estate as payment for the debt, it's ruled that the original division is then void. Also, if three judges were appraising the property of orphans and their appraisals are all different, one saying the land is worth 100 coins and the other is saying it's worth 200 coins, it said the minority opinion is nullified. If all three have differing opinions though, one saying the property is worth 100 coins, the other saying it's worth 80 coins, and the last saying it's worth 120 coins, some say it's just valued at 100 coins as that's the median. Others say we do 90 coins, as we assume the first two judges were off by 10 coins and then we just disregard the last judge's opinion. Others say we subtract the lowest value from the highest value and divide by 3, and add that to the lowest value. So here that would be 93.3 coins. The logic isn't really understood as to why this calculation is used, but it's said that this is the law we hold like. New Mishnah. If somebody sold somebody half his field, but didn't specify which half, the quality falls between them, which will be defined, and the buyer takes half. If the seller said he's selling the southern half of the field, the quality falls between them, and the buyer gets the southern half. Also, the seller must accept upon himself to make space for the fence, a wide trench, which is 6 handbreadths, and a narrow trench, which is 3 handbreadths. The Gemara says in the first case, when it says the quality falls between them, this means the buyer gets the worst half. In the second case, when the seller specified the southern field, the buyer still gets the worst half, as he meant he's selling the value of the southern field. Regarding the trenches, there's a narrow trench dug and then the wide one afterwards outside the actual property. This is to prevent animals from jumping the fence. It's in this order, as if the wide trench was first, the animal could land in the trench and jump out over the fence. The wide trench is necessary to have placed down to prevent the animal from going to the lip of the narrow trench and then just jumping over. The space between these trenches must be a handbreadth. And that's the end of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Tractate Bava Basra discusses at length the various laws of inheritance and the division of the land of Israel. The first Mishnah says there are people who can both inherit from property and give property to their relatives. This would be like a father to his sons, sons to their father, and brothers if they share a father. Some people could only inherit but cannot give property. A man to his mother, a man to his wife, and the sons of sisters. Some people cannot inherit, but can only give property. A woman to her sons, a woman to her husband, and the brothers of a mother. Finally, brothers only from the same mother cannot inherit or give property between each other. The Gemara asks why it begins in order with a father inheriting from his son. Firstly, this is starting with a bit of a tragic scenario, which is something Mishnayos typically do not do. Additionally, the actual verses in scripture state a father passing first and the son inheriting, so it's a bit of an odd choice to start with. So it explains that this case was brought first as it was derived from a scriptural exposition that a father precedes the brothers of a past individual. Although a man's son is stated to be his primary heir, which it proves from some discussions, based on the fact that by the laws of Yibum, the levirate marriage, a son and daughter are treated with the same status. we see that immediately after a son, in order of inheritance, then goes the daughter, then goes the father, and then others. The relevant verses and sources are additionally discussed, and it brings up some scriptural figures as it discusses the family trees, and it mentions that a person should always stay near a righteous family and marry into them, as this will cause you to have righteous descendants. This is seen with Aaron, who married the daughter of the righteous Aminadab and had Pinchas descend from him. Pinchas also descended from Jethro, but it was removed by several generations. It's also said that when marrying a woman, you should examine the characteristics of her brothers, as seen from the verse when Aaron married his wife, it mentions her brother. This is says, most sons resemble their mother's brothers. Some additional verses are quoted. It says some further alternative sources on the point that a son inherits before a daughter, along with the source for the point that brothers from a common father can inherit and give property between each other. Sources for the other points are cited, and a few particular incidents and cases are quoted. The scriptural source for the point that a man inherits from his wife, but not vice versa, applies, along with some additional sources which are then discussed. There are further points related. During the time of the division of the land of Israel, there was a principle that if a woman had parents from two different tribes, so she was inheriting land from both of them, she should specifically marry somebody from her father's tribe. It explains the logic of this. This is said to mean that her husband's father must be of the same tribe as her own father, although her husband's mother can still be of the same tribe as her own mother. Now, it's a debate as to if this concern of inheritance, applying by the differing tribes by the division of the land of Israel, is of the woman's son's inheritance or of her husband's inheritance. A number of verses are quoted showing it's a concern of inheritance through her husband. Also, from other verses, it's said that a husband does not inherit his wife's prospective assets that she receives after her passing, rather that only goes to her sons. Anyways, we had said that the sons of a sister inherit but don't give property to each other. In fact, the sons of a sister actually take precedence over the daughters of a sister. Also, from a verse, it seems to say that a person can only pass down inheritance during the day, not at night, and this is clarified to actually mean that three men cannot pass judgment on inheritance directives that they heard at night, as they were witnesses at that point, so that way they can no longer act as a judge. Related, it said that if two people are verbally exchanging an item, in order to then retract this exchange, some say they have as long as they're still seated in that location. Others say they have until the end of that topic of conversation to retract the exchange. It debates between these opinions. It said we follow this latter opinion. Anyways, it has stated specifically that a woman can give property to her husband and son to show that it occurs in the same way, that a husband does not inherit from his wife after she passes, so too a son doesn't inherit from his mother towards his half-brothers from his father after she passes. Others actually disagree and say a woman actually does inherit from her son, which is derives from a verse, and it debates this further. New Mishnah. Based on the verse, if a man should die and he has no son, you shall transfer his inheritance to his daughters. We know that within the laws of inheritance, a son takes precedence over a daughter, and also the descendants of the son take precedence over the daughter. A daughter takes precedence over the deceased man's brothers, as do the descendants of the daughter. A brother takes precedence over brothers of the father of the deceased, as do the descendants of the brother. As a rule, anybody that takes precedence has their descendants also take precedence, although an inheriting man takes precedence over his own descendants. The Gemara quotes further sources. If a man has no offspring whatsoever, it said we search upwards along his lineage until we find the closest living relative. This goes upwards until whichever of the 12 sons of Jacob he's descended from, not further, as there's a tradition that no tribe of Israel will ever go extinct. It's also said that the daughter of a son of the deceased takes precedence over the daughter of the deceased, and saying otherwise is mistaken. There are some relevant points, and it also speaks on the great negativity and tragedy of somebody who passes without leaving a son after him. A number of verses on this are quoted. It's also asked if a person is survived by his father's father and his own brothers, which of them takes precedence, and it said the man's brother takes precedence over his grandfather. Anyways, a bit of an aside, just to summarize, the order of inheritance as established is as follows. A son, a son's offspring, then a daughter, the daughter's offspring. If there are none of those, the father is next. If the father isn't alive, it goes to his brothers. Next in order is the brother's offspring, then his sisters or his sister's offspring, then goes the father's father and the father's brothers, then the father's brother's offspring, then the father's sisters and the father's sister's offspring. Afterwards it goes to the great-grandfather, etc., working its way up. New Mishnah. In the Torah, the verses state how the daughters of Tzelofchad took 3 portions of inheritance within Israel. Their father's portion, as he had left Egypt, their uncle's portion, and a third share as their father was a firstborn. The Gemara says this is evidently in accordance with the opinion that those that left Egypt were to receive a portion in the land of Israel. Others disagree and say that the portions were divided between those that entered Israel, as the land was then inherited, in a sense, by their deceased fathers who had left Egypt, where it then reverted back to them. Alternatively, based on verses, the land was divided between those that left Egypt and those that entered Israel, meaning if you had done either of them, you'd get 1 portion, and if you had done both, you would get 2 portions. Particularly, Joshua and Caleb, Yehoshua and Caleb, took the other spies' portions, and Korach and his followers had no portion. Their children got portions based on their grandparents, unrelated to the event. The relevant verses are quoted. There's also an unresolved issue with one verse that implies, unlike that the land was divided according to those that entered Israel, according to the opinion that the land was divided according to those entering Israel, the daughters of Tzalafchad were actually requesting the share of their grandfather, as their father had not entered Israel. Similarly, according to this opinion, the children of Joseph petitioned for extra land, even though they entered Israel, as they had many children, under 20, so they would have received a lesser amount. Some suggest that these specified petitions show that every other person was fine and received a portion in Israel. Others say the request of Joseph is simply recorded to teach that a person should beware of the evil eye, as they were advised to live in forests. However, they responded, saying that the evil eye has no power over the descendants of Joseph, as they're compared to a fish, which are immune as they're covered by water. It quotes sources for the division of portions between the spies and the followers of Korach. These are discussed, and it particularly qualifies the inheritance of the daughters of Tzalafchad. These are discussed, and it asks how the daughters of Tzalafchad could request an extra portion as their father was a firstborn, as firstborns receiving double doesn't apply to prospective assets. So some suggest they weren't asking for the land, they were requesting his actual property. Others say that the land of Israel was considered to have been in their possession since they left Egypt, although others debated from a source. It said, actually, Moshe was uncertain as to whether this was the case, and it was clarified that it was an inheritance, but it won't be received by those that left Egypt themselves, as they all ended up passing in the desert. It also expounds further on the incident with the daughters of Tzalafchad. It said that they were wise as they spoke in a timely manner, they were knowledgeable in Torah as they knew the law, and that they were righteous as they waited a while to marry people befitting their station. It said that because of this, the same miracle that occurred for Yocheved occurred for them, which is that they retained the beauty of their youth even when they were old. It's also said that sometimes the verses list the daughters in different orders, sometimes in order of age, other times in order of wisdom, although others say that it's to show that they were all equal. It further expounds on these verses, on their marriage, that they only married fitting individuals, and similar. This is discussed along with other points on the prohibitions that existed for certain individuals to marry outside of their tribes, as was briefly mentioned earlier. This is relevant for the holiday on the 15th of the month of Tu B'Av, wherein all the tribes would have their marriages, along with marriages between tribes. Now, there were other things that this holiday of Tu B'Av celebrated, although that's more discussed in the very last pages of Tractate Ta'inus. But essentially this celebrated the ending of the deaths in the wilderness, and it also celebrated the day that the guards blocking the roads to the pilgrimage holidays in Jerusalem were removed. It's the day where those killed in the Battle of Beitar were finally buried, and it was also the day that they stopped cutting trees for the altar pyre. Related, it said that there are 7 righteous men that had their total lives span across the entire world. There was Adam, who lived until Mesushelach, who lived until Shem, who lived until Jacob, who lived until Amram, who lived until Achia, the Shilonite, who lived until Elijah the prophet, Eliyahu Hanavi, who is still around to this day. The relevant verses to calculate their ages and dates are also brought back to the division of the land. It said that it was divided according to the tribes, not by head count, based on some verses. It was done so with the Urim V'Tumim on the Kohen Gadol's breastplate, and also a lottery was drawn to divide the portions of land between tribes. It is said that when Mashiach comes, everybody will have land of all the different variants, and it'll be divided between 13 tribes, an additional one for the Nasi, Mashiach. During the original division of land, those that received lesser portions of land would be monetarily reimbursed based on the difference in value between land by its distance to Jerusalem. Others said that they just would receive other lands. Everybody received their portion by lottery, besides for Joshua and Kalev, whose portion is specified in verses as given by the word of God. It clarifies which portions exactly these were. New Mishnah. Both the son and daughter are subject to the laws of inheritance, although a firstborn son receives a double portion from his father alone, not from his mother, while daughters are supported only from their father's estate and not from their mother's. The Gemara says, when it states that a son and daughter are subject to the laws of inheritance, actually a son takes precedence over a daughter in inheritance, so there are a few suggestions as to what that exactly meant. Firstly, if they are inheriting, both inherit property not yet owned by their father, the same as typical property. This cannot be the case, as it was already implied by the prior Mishnah about the daughters of Tzalafchad, so that would be repetitive. So rather what it means is that both a son or daughter would take an extra portion if their father was a firstborn. Again, this would be redundant. A third option, it means that whether there's a son amongst other sons or a daughter amongst other daughters, if the father says that this particular child should inherit everything, he does. Others debate this. So a final explanation is that it means that a son or daughter are equal to inherit from their mother and father's estate, although a firstborn son inherits double from specifically his father's estate. A number of verses are quoted in support of this, which are then discussed. Related regarding these verses, it mentions Leah's marriage to Jacob, and prior to this, it says that her eyes were ra'akus, meaning tender. Some interpret this to mean like the word arukas, meaning longer, showing that her descendants many generations down the line would be very great. Others say it's literal. She was a very sad person because people would frequently say that she would one day marry Esav, and she would often cry over that. Additionally, Jacob was supposed to marry Rachel and worked for many years to do so, as the verses state, but her father switched her out for her sister Leah, and Jacob didn't realize until after they were married. It's explained this was as Jacob and Rachel suspected her father, Lavan, might try such a thing, so they designed some secret sign to identify themselves to each other when they were getting married. However, when Rachel saw her sister being switched out, she realized her sister might get very embarrassed, so she taught Leah the signs, and Jacob married Leah, and then only much later on married Rachel. Related verses on the subject are discussed. Anyways, back to inheritance. It cites a number of different cases showing that a firstborn inherits double from his father. And there's apparently a debate between Rebbe and the sages. Rebbe saying that a firstborn takes a double portion in benefits that are received after the father's death but before the division of property, and the sages disagree. It's a debate as to who precisely we hold like. Related, it said that a firstborn does not receive a double portion from a loan owed to his father. This is in accordance with the opinion of the sages, and it's necessary to state as the father here had an actual document. Others say a firstborn gets a double portion from an owed loan, just not from the interest of the loan. Again, according to the opinion of the sages, and specifically according to the view that a loan is considered to have been collected during the father's lifetime. A related case is cited, and others disagree with this latter principle. These opinions are more particularly qualified. For instance, there's a case, a man said that when he passed, his property should go to his grandmother, and after she passed, it should go to his heirs. The man had a single married daughter who died before everybody else, and then the father died, and then the grandmother died. It said we hold the husband does not inherit anything, as the inheritance was entirely prospective, which is a type of asset that a husband does not inherit from his wife. Others disagree and say that he would, although the final law is that a husband does not inherit prospective assets through his wife if she had passed. And also the law is that a firstborn does not get a double portion of his past father's prospective assets, and also a firstborn does not take a double portion from a loan, be it of money or of land. Also, if the father had a loan with the firstborn, so he owed his father money, the firstborn and his brothers divide the extra firstborn portion. Further, it had been stated that if heirs improve property belonging to their father after his passing, but before the estate had been divided, the firstborn does not receive a double portion of this increased improvement. He can, however, protest against them doing this. This is qualified, saying if they harvested grapes or olives, the firstborn still gets a double portion from those, but if they had made wine or oil, the firstborn would not get double this portion. Others disagree and say the firstborn would receive from the wine as he's being compensated for the damage done to his grapes. Additionally, stated if a firstborn takes a share equal to all of his other brothers, he's renounced his firstborn portion. Others say it's specifically within this field, others say it's across all properties. This debate is discussed. Related, it's ruled that a firstborn has rights in his extra portion before the division of the estate, and some related incidents are brought. New Mishnah, if somebody says that his firstborn son should not inherit a double portion, or that one of his sons should not receive a portion, this is not allowed, as he's directly contradicting Torah law. However, if the properties are being distributed orally as a gift, he can vary between his heirs however he wants, just as long as he's not giving them as an inheritance. If it's being done through a document, the word gift must actually be specified somewhere within. The Gemara says, most hold that a stipulation cannot be made that contradicts Torah law. Some say that a betrothal can be made on condition that the husband does not need to keep to any of the obligations of a husband towards a wife, as it's a monetary matter, but that's unique, as the wife is agreeing to it, unlike by inheritance, where the son has no say. It's also stated, if a father says, so-and-so is my firstborn son, he's believed to be the firstborn and inherits accordingly. If the father had a son and said, so-and-so is a firstborn, he would not inherit extra, as is possible he meant he was the firstborn to his mother. Related incidents are cited. Uniquely, a tumtum, somebody with a flesh covering their genitals, making their gender indeterminate. If the covering is opened and he's found to be a male, such a person would not inherit double, as the verse states that inheritance is only towards somebody who is discernible as male from birth. Additionally, such an individual cannot be judged as a wayward and rebellious son, which will be discussed more in Chapter 8 of Tractate Sanhedrin. Another similar law, a tumtum does not cause any change or adjustment to the firstborn's inheritance, and also such a baby is not circumcised on the 8th day. However, it is said that a woman becomes impure after giving birth to a tumtum, the same as any kid. Based on this, there's an unresolved question if there actually is a delay in circumcision, although it brings sources for the remaining cited points. Additionally, it's explained that if two newborns were born, recognized, and then got mixed up, they can write a monetary collection permissibility document to the other, so that way they can collect their firstborn double inheritance. If they were not initially recognized, they cannot do this. Others held if there's a presumption that one child is the father's firstborn, and the father says, no, this other son is my firstborn, they should write this monetary collection document for each other, and then split the double portion. This was as he was uncertain what the ruling is as to if a father is believed to identify his firstborn son. Such a debate is relevant, for instance, as typically a father can just gift whatever properties he wants to whichever children, so this case is specifically useful if, for instance, properties were granted to a father while he was about to die, as he can't give over property then. There are additional rulings. If somebody identifies somebody as his son and then later retracted this to say that he's his slave, this second statement is not believed. However, if somebody identified a man as his slave and then retracted this and said he's his son, he is believed because he could have been saying that his son serves him like a slave initially. If the context is in tax collection, then the inverse is true. If somebody identifies his son by a tax collector as a slave, he's believed, as this increases his taxes. If he identified his slave as his son here, however, he would not be believed. This concept is additionally discussed. Some points are ruled on. It said if one man claims another person stole his slave, and this second person says, no, it was sold to me or given as a gift, but then offers the first man to take an oath that the slave is his to reclaim it, and then the first man takes this oath, the second man must return the slave, and he cannot retract this. Another point, there's a debate of debt payments can be collected from slaves left over as an inheritance. It's also ruled testimony of a man to his parents' first cousin is a valid testimony. Others say it's even valid to testify towards one's great uncle, and it's ruled that a person cannot testify towards his grandfather. Another point, there's a debate if a person can testify on land for another person after he becomes blind. Some say no, others say yes, as he could remember the boundaries. Others say he can even testify on a garment. Others say he can even testify on a metal bar. It discusses these opinions. Another case, as mentioned, there's a debate if a person is believed to identify one of his children as his firstborn. Our opinion says he is believed. Another point, if somebody says his wife should take a share of his property like his son's, then she does, as long as the properties are currently owned. Also, this gift is calculated, including any sons born at a later time. Another ruling, if a lender says he hasn't been repaid and the borrower says he repaid half, and witnesses say that the borrower repaid everything, in such a case, the borrower takes an oath that he paid half, and the lender takes half from specifically unencumbered properties. It said the law is in accordance with all of these rulings, and it explains who this excludes. It was said in the Mishnah that a father can gift his property to his children whenever he wants. It explains the different ways of phrasing such a gift. There are a number of different opinions on this subject. It debates sources for these opinions. Specifically, it's ruled that if a second statement is made after the first, in the time it takes to make an utterance, they're viewed as one statement. The exception to this is a statement of idolatry. For instance, if somebody worships something as an idol and then immediately retracts it, the retraction doesn't count. He's already worshipped an idol. And also, there's no immediate retractions by betrothal. New Mishnah. If somebody said that somebody else should inherit from him when he already has a daughter, or he said that his daughter should inherit from him when he already has a son, this is ineffective, again, as it contradicts Torah law. Others say his words stand only if he's speaking about somebody fit to inherit from him, which will be explained. The Gemara explains the different view of the second opinion, possibly that he's saying that somebody can have a non-heir inherit, or possibly that there's just a grammatical difference, and it's saying that the second opinion is just the source for the first one. Although it is said that we hold the law is like the second opinion, and it says scriptural sources for this. This concept is additionally discussed, and it mentions the practices of some sages in regards to ruling the law. Now, according to this opinion, that a person can choose to give a larger portion of his estate to one of his heirs, there's a debate if this would apply if being done by a healthy person. It debates between these opinions, and this is additionally discussed. It said if a person writes in his will, but he's giving all of his possessions to his wife, she's only made an administrator. The same would apply if done to his eldest son or his youngest son. If the recipient was a non-relative, his betrothed wife or a divorced wife, they would receive it as a gift. There's a dispute as to what the status is if he's giving it to his daughter when he has sons, or to his wife when he has brothers, or to his wife when he has sons from another wife. It's also a debate if he's appointing this person, say his wife, as only an administrator over the property if this is done when he's healthy. Some related laws on writing over property towards one's wife through the marriage contract are discussed. Essentially, it establishes a few unique instances where a woman can give up her collateral rights within her marriage contract, which is a leniency specifically within laws of the marriage contract. It debates the validity of this principle further. There are unresolved points and a few discussed incidents, and they're additionally discussed. Anyways, back to inheritance. Instead of a severely ill person wrote all of his properties over to somebody else, we first check to see the relationship. If the recipient would make a valid heir, he receives it as an inheritance. If he's not fit to inherit, he receives it as a gift. It's argued as to what exactly the practical difference is. It said there's a difference if the giver said the property should go to the man, and then afterwards to a second man. If it was an inheritance as opposed to a gift, the property is never transferred to the second man when the first dies, as an inheritance now, so it would go to his heirs instead. Cases are cited. New Mishnah. If somebody writes over his estate to another person and leaves nothing for his children, it's a valid gift, but it's something that's frowned upon. Others say this is considered to be a good thing if his children were not being proper, that they shouldn't receive an inheritance. The Gemara debates if these two people disagree as to whether heirs of poor character should not inherit. A story is brought. A sage had a son who was acting improper, so the sage took all of his money and consecrated it. The son later got married, and he bought a fish and found a jewel inside and was told to bring it to the temple treasurers to sell it so he'd get a fair price. It's a debate if he either brought 6 times the amount his father had consecrated to the temple, or that he took 7 times his father had consecrated from the temple. So either way, we can't really say if the implication is that the disownment was a good thing, although it is said from elsewhere that generally any form of disownment, even towards a poorly acting son, is viewed negatively. It discusses this from other incidents and also quotes the greatness of the students of the sage Hillel, the least of which was said to be Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was extremely knowledgeable in basically every field: scripture, Mishnah, Gemara, Halacha, law, Agadais, the different arguments and discussions, astronomy, the different parables, medicinal matters, the speech of demons and angels, the incident of the chariot in Ezekiel, and many others. The greatest of the students was the sage Yonasan ben Uziel, about whom it was said that whenever he studied Torah, any bird that flew above him was incinerated. New Mishnah. Regarding laws of inheritance, if somebody identifies another man as his son, he is believed. If somebody identifies another man as his brother, he's not believed. So this new identified brother would only take inheritance from the brother that had identified him. If this new brother then dies, what he had inherited returns only to the brother that identified him. If the new brother had properties from elsewhere, all the brothers inherit from him. The Gemara explains regarding somebody who identifies his son, this is relevant to have him inherit from him and to make his wife no longer responsible to perform the levirate marriage if he passes. Now, both of these points are known from other locations, so it's actually to teach a particular case that a father is believed when he says he has a son in regards to exempting his wife from the levirate marriage, even if there was a presumption that he has a brother. The husband is believed here, as he technically could have just divorced his wife if he wanted to. Based on this, there's a disagreement if a husband is believed if he says he divorced his wife, as if he wants to, he could just divorce his wife. It's explained that he's believed to say he's divorcing her in the future, but not to say he had divorced her in the past. Later, if the husband says he divorced his wife in the past, is the debate if we then believe him to say he divorced her in the future. Some particular incidents are discussed. The case of a man identifying another person as his brother is qualified. It's particularly where the other brothers say they don't know whether this man is their brother or not. Anyways, if the new alleged brother inherited property, but then made improvements to it and then died, what's the status of the improvements? And that stands unresolved. New Mishnah. If a person dies and they find a sickbed will tied to his leg, it has no legal validity. If he had transferred his will to another man, whether they're an heir or not, they would acquire the property. The Gemara takes some time to provide the definitions for the word for a sickbed will. Anyways, it's asked if a very sick person told somebody to write a document to deliver some money to somebody and then died before this was done, it said the document is not written and the money is not delivered, as he might have wanted to give it only through the document, and the document is not valid after death. There's a debate as to who taught this and some debate the ruling. It said the law is that we do actually write and deliver a document after a man's death. New Mishnah. If somebody writes his properties over to his sons but wants to keep using them until he dies, it's a debate if it's necessary for him to write that this gift takes effect from today and after death. If he did do this, the father can no longer sell this property as they're written towards the sons, and the sons can't sell it because they're in the father's possession. If the father sold them, the sale lasts until he dies. If the son sold them, the buyer only owns them once the father dies. The Gemara explains the specification of this taking effect from today and after death is to say that the property should be taken from today and the produce should be taken after his death. Saying this by a divorce document creates an uncertainty because we're not really sure if this is a stipulation or a retraction. The reason others say the specification is just not necessary is as they say the recorded date shows the time it takes effect. So there's a debate as to if either would concede if the document records the actual acquisition. It essentially rules no matter if the document begins or ends with the specification of an acquisition, it would not be necessary to write the words from today according to either opinion. If the document started with the words, "This is a testament to the matters that took place before us," then there would be an argument if the words "from today" are necessary to be added. Anyways, in the case where the father writes his properties over to his son, but partially retains them while he's alive, if the son then sold them while his father was still alive, and then the son passed away first, it's a debate if the buyer acquires this property. This is based on whether the right to produce of a property is the same as the rights and ownership of the property itself. This was actually already discussed, but it's being taught here also by a father and son to show that it still applies, even though you might think that a father would typically be more generous towards his son. It additionally debates his opinions. It is, however, ruled that if somebody says that his property should go to one man and then after to another man, the second man only gets what the first man chooses to leave him. However, if the first man gives his property away while he's very sick as a gift, it would still go to the second man as he has priority. This would even apply to the ownership of Canaanite slaves. that they go to the second man even if the first freed them, meaning he can do whatever he wants with his property. And this would even apply if the first man made the property into shrouds for the deceased, that the second man received the leftovers, again certain the first man can do whatever he wants with his property, even making it into items that are forbidden to be benefited from. Another instance of this case would be if somebody gave a man an esrog as a gift, telling him that afterwards it should go to the second man. Others disagree and say that it's universally agreed that the esrog can be used for the sukkah ceremony. The only debate is if he can decide to sell it or eat it. A particular case, if brothers purchase an esrog with funds of an undivided inheritance, and one of them used the esrog on the holiday of Sukkot, it said if he had been able to eat the esrog if he had wanted to, his obligation on the esrog is fulfilled, otherwise it's not. If only one brother had the esrog, and the others only had some other fruit, he would not be allowed to use the esrog without permission. It's also said if somebody gives somebody an esrog as a gift on condition that it's returned, the man's obligation is only fulfilled once he returns the esrog. This shows that a gift granted on condition that it's returned is legally considered to be a gift. Related incidents are brought. For instance, if somebody gave a man an ox as a gift on condition that it's returned, and the man took the ox and consecrated it to the temple before returning it, then that's valid. This is clarified to apply unless the original owner said that it should be returned to me, meaning in a manner that he could still use it. Regarding refusing a gift, if somebody refuses a gift immediately, he does not receive it. If he is silent and only later refuses it, he nevertheless has acquired the gift. This is discussed. Another point, if a very sick man said to give 200 coins to one man and 300 to another and 400 to another, they don't receive these funds in order, rather they all receive their gifts simultaneously. If he said to give 200 coins to one man and after 300 coins to another man and after 400 to another, the funds are given in order of specification, so if there's insufficient funds, the first ones would have priority. Related, if a very sick man says to give 200 coins to his firstborn as befits him, the firstborn receives 200 coins besides for his firstborn portion. If he said the coins should be given for his firstborn portion, the son could take either the portion or the coins. The same applies with giving coins to a wife regarding her marriage contract. If, however, somebody said to give 200 coins to his creditor for the debt, the man can only take it to repay the debt. It's discussed. Another point, if the sick man says somebody owes him money, it's a debate if witnesses mark this down for the heirs to collect, depending on whether or not they recognize this debt to be legitimate or not. It's ruled that they can write this down even if they're not sure if it's legitimate, as there's no concern the court will make an error. This is additionally debated, and it's explained that the witnesses in question will be verified by the court. New Mishnah. A father can detach produce from his field to feed whoever he wants while he's alive. Whatever he left detached after he dies belongs to the heirs. The Gemara says the implication is that attached produce does not belong to all of the heirs. This applies specifically here, as the father would be giving the produce to his son and wants to include the attached produce in that. New Mishnah. If a father passed away and left older and younger sons, the older ones cannot support themselves from his estate at the expense of the younger ones, and the younger ones are not fed from the estate at the expense of the older ones. Rather, it's divided equally. If the older ones married with the estate's funds, the younger sons can do this also, but only according to what their father gave them, not by a corresponding amount. Similarly, if the father left older and younger daughters, they cannot support themselves at the expense of the others. It's divided equally, and they can marry from the estate, but only by what was specified. Daughters are fed at the expense of other sons, but not at the expense of other daughters. The Gemara says, while a brother cannot take funds from an undivided estate at the expense of his brothers, even to get cheap clothes, if he has done so, it's not required to be returned. The point on variance by marriage is that if the older daughters were married while the father was alive and then the father passed, the other daughters cannot get married according to the same cost as the older sisters. Related, it's asked, if a woman borrows money and this is undocumented and spent it and then got married, is the husband considered to be a purchaser or heir of the purchased property? To debate this from our discussions, it essentially establishes that the husband would not get the most favorable status if it results in the loss of another. This is unique by this husband, who's being essentially treated as a prior purchaser, as he wasn't married during the borrowing of the woman. And that's the end of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Tractate Bava Basra continues covering the various laws of inheritance and the laws of sickbed wills. The first Mishnah says, if somebody dies leaving behind sons and daughters, if he had a very large estate, his sons would inherit from it, and his daughters are supported from it. If he has a very small estate, the daughters are still supported from it, and the sons need to figure out their own income. Others disagreed, saying it's unfair to lose out because they're a male, and some ruled like this opinion. The Gemara says, a large estate here is defined as one large enough to support the sons and daughters for 12 months. Others say it's enough to support the daughters until they become adults. According to this explanation, if there's a small estate, it would mean that support is taken for the daughters enough until they grow up, and the remainder would go to the sons. If, after the father's death, the property went from a high value to a very low one because prices rose, the heirs have already somebody acquired the property. If, however, it was a very small estate and the prices dropped, making it into a large estate, it's debated if the heirs inherit it typically, and it's explained that it would be inherited by the sons. It's a debate as to whether the size of the estate is calculated including or excluding the claim of the widow, as she is entitled to some support, but on the other hand, she would also lose this entitlement if she remarries. Further, this would account for his stepdaughter, as if she remarries, she still would inherit, but if she dies, she would lose any claim to the estate. And further, what about somebody who lent the man money, as he has a claim to the property even if he dies, but the claim is not collected? Some actually invert this order. It's also asked whether a widow or a daughter takes precedence. It said the widow does. When it was suggested that a male should not lose out on support just because of his gender, some say this as he's supposed to be occupied with Torah study. Others say simply that it's just not fair that a male inherits when there's a large estate but wouldn't when there's a small one. New Mishnah. If the deceased individual left behind sons, daughters, and a tumtum, somebody of indeterminate gender due to his genitals being covered by excess flesh, if there's a large estate, the tumtum would inherit along with the daughters being supported. As mentioned, if there's a small estate, he is treated like a male. If somebody with a pregnant wife says if she gives birth to a boy, the child will get 100 zuz coins. If it's a boy, the child gets 100 zuz. If he says if it's a girl, she'll get 200 zuz coins, and it's a girl, she gets 200 zuz. And if he says if it's a boy, it'll get 100 coins, and if it's a girl, it'll get 200. If it's a boy, he gets 100. If it's a girl, she gets 200. And if it's a tumtum, he gets nothing. If the father said, whatever my wife gives birth to will get a specific amount and gives birth to a tumtum, the child gets that amount. If the tumtum is the only child, he'll inherit everything. The Gemara says there's a debate when we say that if there's a large estate, the tumtum inherits with the daughters, as to whether this means he just inherits nothing, unlike the boys, or he actually inherits with the daughters, getting similar support as them. It additionally debates this from other sources. In the Mishnah, the reason the father promised a larger sum in the example by the daughters is explained to be because typically a father prefers to provide provisions for a daughter. Others explain it says it's better to have a daughter first, possibly as then it's a good omen for sons, possibly as she'll then raise her brothers, possibly as then the evil eye will have no power over them. Others say it's just according to the opinion that daughters are preferable and their support has priority. Later cases are discussed. There's a particular instance. Somebody declared his property towards his pregnant wife's fetus. It was said that the fetus does not acquire property. This apparently disagrees with our Mishnah, which said a person can promise amounts of money based on the birth of his child. It debates as to therefore what exactly our Mishnah could be referring to. For instance, we try to suggest that the Mishnah refers to the father saying the baby should acquire once the wife gives birth to it, but it's explained that this opinion holds that in such a case the baby does not acquire the money. It's essentially a debate as to whether a fetus can acquire property before it's born. Some say it's specifically permissible by inheritance. Others say it would be uniquely permissible by if the father was a convert, as the property was uncertain. There's a practical difference if people heard the fetus passed, so people claimed the property, and then found out that the fetus had died after they had claimed the property. It debates further from a few cases as to whether a fetus is actually considered to be able to inherit property. It said that a firstborn born after a father's passing does not receive a double portion, and any sons born after don't reduce the firstborn's double portion. In fact, it's also ruled that if somebody grants possession of an item to a fetus, the fetus does not acquire a portion. A case is discussed. A man told his wife that all of his belongings should go to their sons that will eventually be born. But when an older son from a different wife asked for an inheritance, he was told to acquire property the same as the other sons. So as the unborn children cannot acquire anything, it's a debate if the alive son can acquire based on the statement. It said that it was held he would not receive a portion in such a case. Related, if somebody says to another to acquire this gift like the donkey, the recipient receives nothing. But if the man said that you and the donkey should acquire this gift, some say half this item goes to the man and half to the donkey that's being referenced. Some say all goes to the recipient. Some say nothing goes to the recipient. It debates proof from various different sources. Similarly, if somebody tells his wife that his belongings will belong to you and to your sons, some say the woman gets half of everything. Some say it's all divided equally between everybody. It is ruled in accordance with this last opinion, among others. It rules on some other particular cases. For instance, a sick man said that his belongings should go to his sons, and it was ruled that this could only refer to sons, not grandsons. New Mishnah. If somebody passed away and left adults and minor children, and the adults improve the estate by increasing its value, this improvement is shared by everybody equally. If, however, the adults declare publicly that they're only improving their own portions, they would specifically inherit the improvements. The same applies with a wife. If she improves an estate, it's improved for all heirs, unless she clarifies beforehand that she's doing so specifically for herself. The Gemara says this improvement, that applies to all heirs, is only when the improvement was within the estate itself. If the heir used his own personal funds, then the improvement goes to himself, even without any necessary stipulation. The other points are discussed, and it mentions specifically the case of a wife improving the property to show the same laws apply by a wife, even though it was less common for women to work with property. Or possibly even though you might think that she was doing the improvements for the orphans. A somewhat related ruling, it said if somebody marries off their son in a wedding house, which was a special house built for a wedding, the son acquires the house. So long as he's the eldest son, he's marrying a virgin, and it's his first marriage, and he's the first of his siblings getting married. If the house has an upper story, he would not acquire the upper story, and if there is a portico, or if there's two houses, one inside the other, those go unresolved. Additional sources are cited. New Mishnah. If two brothers were partners in ownership of an undivided estate and one of them starts to work, the work payments go towards the shared estate. If one brother becomes sick, he is healed from his own resources. The Gemara debates as to what it means when it says one brother got a job. It means he was appointed to the service of the king in this case, specifically as representative of the owner of the field, not through his own merit. Additional cases are discussed. Specifically, when it was said if one brother became sick, he must be healed from his own finances. This is particularly if his illness was due to his own negligence. Otherwise, he can pay his medical expenses from the shared property. New Mishnah. If some brothers were groomsmen while their father was alive, which was something that entailed bringing gifts to the groom as a tradition in those days, when these men eventually married, they would receive their own reciprocal gifts, and this would go to the common estate, as this reciprocal gift was something enforceable in court. However, if this brother received just a regular present of a jar of wine, for instance, he can keep it for himself. The Gemara quotes a different case, which seems to say that actually, regarding a reciprocal groom's gift, the man gets to keep it personally. So it suggests a few interpretations of that case that fit in accordance with our Mishnah. It also discusses some points on returning the betrothal sum after a groom's passing. It essentially is a debate if this fund is at all retrievable. Some say it varies in the region regarding betrothal sums, although it does say a bridal gift would be returned. There are additional particular points discussed regarding the old custom of reciprocal groomsmen gifts, and it also expounds on some relevant verses. New Mishnah. If somebody sends a bridal gift, which was a custom during those times, to his father-in-law's house, even if he sent as much as 10,000 dinarim, after only having eaten a groom's meal worth a single dinar, the bridal gift is not collected if the marriage gift doesn't go through. If he didn't eat a meal, then whatever gift he sent is collected. If he sent a large number of gifts and he specified that they should return with her to his own house, then she can collect those gifts. If he sent a small number of bridal gifts and specified she should use them in her father's house, they're not collected. The Gemara specifies in the first case, for it to be applicable, that the marriage gifts are non-returnable. If he eats a dinner's worth meal at his father-in-law's house, this would not apply if it was worth less than a dinner, hence the specification. This would also apply if he only drank, as it could be a very expensive drink. It's a debate what the status is if he gets sent food from his future father-in-law and eats it outside of the house, and there are some additional unresolved points. It's also a debate as to what the status is with depletable gifts, if they were given and were then not consumed. A few particular cases are additionally discussed. New Mishnah. Normally, any act of acquisition needs a formal transfer. An extremely sick person, however, is uniquely allowed to verbally transfer his property, assuming he actually ends up passing away. If an extremely sick person signed away all of his property to others, but decided to retain some for himself, the other gifts stand as valid even if he recovers. If he did not retain any land, if he recovers, his gifts are all undone. The Gemara explains which opinion that holds like these laws. This is discussed, and it also quotes scriptural sources for the point that an extremely sick person can verbally give over his property. Related, it mentions that Achitophel, King David's general who betrayed King David to ally with the Prince Absalom, before he took his own life after he saw the rebellion failing, he told his sons three things: to not fight amongst each other, to never again rebel against the Davidic dynasty, and also if the sky is clear by the holiday of Shavuos, to plant wheat crops that year. It debates what this weather by the last one is exactly referring to, and there are some additional omens for the year's weather that are listed. It said if it's hot or cold on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, then the year will be hot or cold, respectively. This made a difference in what the Kohen Gadol would pray for. Anyways, back to sickbed gifts. Some say the concept is actually entirely of rabbinic enactment, which was made for the peace of mind of sick individuals. Others disagree and say that it has scriptural source. Anyways, it said that a very sick person actually does not have the rights to declare somebody allowed to live in his house or eat of the fruits of his trees, although he is allowed to give ownership of the actual house or the actual trees. This is qualified. Anyways, if somebody gave a tree to one man and then its fruit to another man, it's a debate if the second acquisition is valid. This is additionally discussed. Anyways, if a very sick person signs away all of his possessions to people, we see what his intentions were beforehand. If he always planned on doing this, it's valid, unless he recovers. If he did not plan on doing this initially and wanted to only give some of his possessions and evidently change his mind, if he recovers, he can only renege on the last gift. Similarly, it said if an extremely sick person signed away all of his possessions to others and then recovered, he cannot renege on this, as he might still have some properties that exist in a different location. It said this is presumed to not be the case, though. Anyways, there's also a debate if somebody retracts his sickbed gift to give to somebody else. It's argued if this fully retracts the first man's gifts or only the parts he promised to the second man. It's said to be a full retraction of the first man's gift, as seen from other broad cases. There are also a few unresolved questions as to whether a very sick person declares the property to be all consecrated to the temple, if that's valid, or if he declared it to be all ownerless, or to go all to the poor, or otherwise. It also debates the validity of certain particular expressions of granting property, like, he shall be seen in my possessions, and otherwise, and it's unresolved if this is valid. If a very sick man sells all of his possessions, if he recovers, if he kept the proceeds from the sale, he can retract, otherwise not. It's also debate as to what the law is by a very sick man admitting that some properties in his possession don't actually belong to him, if he's believed or not. Anyways, we had stated that if the sick man had retained any land for himself, any property he gifted stays gifted, even if he recovers. How much property he needs to retain is discussed. Some say enough land to sustain himself, others say enough movable properties to sustain himself. It debates these. Related points are discussed. It also brings up some particular expressions. If somebody said his movable properties should go to somebody, that includes all of his utensils, but excludes wheat and barley. If he said all my movable properties should go to somebody, that includes even wheat and barley and an upper millstone, just not the lower one. If he said anything that can be moved, the lower millstone would be included also. It's also debated as to whether a slave is considered to have the status of land or a movable property by these laws. Related, it said there are 5 scenarios where there's variation between somebody writing away some of his property and him writing away all of his property to another person. These include an extremely sick person, as we're discussing, somebody giving property to a slave, where if all of his property is given, the slave also goes free, to his wife, where if all the property is given, she becomes an administrator, to his sons, where it could cause the wife to forfeit her marriage contract if she's assigned any land, and also to a widow who hides away her property before being married to retain it for herself, as she must sign over her property to a third party. By all of these, movable property is considered to be as significant withholding as land, besides for by the marriage contract, unless the movables are actually specified within the marriage contract. The word possessions, when used, could reference a slave, land, an article of clothing, coins, and documents, as seen in a few cases. It could also include animals or birds and tefillin, and whether or not it includes a Torah scroll is unresolved. A few particular incidents of women sequestering personal items when entering a marriage are brought, and the resulting laws are discussed. It also brings a few other cases of sickbed gifts. It explains if an extremely sick individual writes only part of his property away towards another individual. Some explain this actually to have the exact same status as a typical gift, in that it cannot be retracted and requires a formal acquisition. Others debate this latter notion. In the end, the final law is held that an extremely sick person's partial gift does actually require formal acquisition, and this would still apply even if he dies afterwards. Although if somebody gives instructions out of concern that he's about to pass, he does not need to perform an act of acquisition, so long as he does end up winding up dying. If he does actually recover, he can retract this even though an acquisition was witnessed. Now, if somebody gave a proper sickbed gift and then also unnecessarily performed an actual formal acquisition, some say that it's fine, but both apply. So it's like a typical gift, and it can no longer be retracted, but it's also like a sickbed gift, meaning he could viably transfer a loan owed to him towards another person. Others disagree and say it's just unresolved, as it could be the sick man wants the transaction to be done specifically with that document, which would be invalid after his death. Apparently, these opinions seem to contradict themselves elsewhere, but it's explained that there's variation between the discussed cases. And that's spoken on. Now, it's established that a sick man can write a second sickbed will, which overrides the first one. But what if a person decided to sign away all of his property to 2 different people, one after the other? Some say it goes to the first man, as it should be treated like the gift of a healthy man, which cannot be revoked. Others say it goes to the second man, as he says it's like a sickbed gift, so the first will would be revoked. Now, this was technically already discussed by the earlier discussion of a sick man's gift given along with an acquisition, but this is repeated here as there was no acquisition done, and there's variation on this cited. Additionally, in a case where a sick man wrote a will that his property should be transferred to another man in life and in death, it said that we hold it's a sickbed gift, and this applies even if the words from life were written instead. Additional incidents are cited. New Mishnah, if a very sick man wrote a gift document, but he forgot to mention in the actual document that he was extremely sick, and he then recovered, and then there was a debate if the man was actually sick when he wrote the document, as to if he can then revoke the gift, as there's no written proof that he was actually ever sick. It's a debate. Rabbi Meir says the burden of proof to show that he was sick rests on the gift giver. The sages say it rests on the people trying to receive payment. The Gemara quotes a case. A gift document had the words that it was written when he was ill and lying in bed, but it did not write that he had passed without recovery, as would be necessary. So some said, if a man died, that should be proof enough that he died of the illness, in accordance with a related opinion. The principle has applicability by some laws of impurity. According to the latter opinion of the Mishnah, that the burden of proof rests on the gift recipients. Some say this must be done through witnesses, which is explained. Some say it must be done through certification of the gift document, and it disputes between these. In fact, it's discussed as to in what situations certifying a document is necessary. If a man admitted to writing a document, it's disputed if there's then any necessity to certify such a document. In fact, some even reverse the opinions of Rabbi Meir and the sages as to who the burden of proof lies on, and additionally reverse the opinions of those that debate whether the proof must be of witnesses or document certification. Somewhat related, it said that a minor is not allowed to sell the property of his passed away father. Some say this stands until he's 18, others say until he's 20. It additionally debates between these opinions, also quoting the classifications of a saris, an adult male who has not yet had any physical signs of development, which was discussed in an earlier tractate. It's also asked if this 18 or 20-year-old age limit before an orphan can sell his father's property, as to whether this includes or excludes that actual last 20th year. Anyways, there is an exception to this principle. It said if a minor is extremely knowledgeable in sales and purchases, then this person could validly make purchases or sales with their late father's estate. Although by laws of testimony, an adult orphan can validly testify, although some say specifically on movable properties and not on land. Additionally, it's said that an adult orphan's gifts are valid. This is explained as people could manipulate orphans into making poor sales, but if they're giving a gift, they'll only be doing so because they want to, if they received some benefit from the man. It's also said to know if somebody is an adult, they'd have to typically check themselves for physical signs of adulthood, which applies by marriage, divorce from a levirate marriage, chalitza, rejecting a levirate marriage, and miyun, refusing a marriage. By an orphan selling property of his late father, he just has to wait until he's 20 years of age. Some rulings, it said that this opinion applies, that a minor needs to wait until he's actually 20, past his birthday, to be able to sell his late father's property. It's also ruled that a very knowledgeable minor can sell their father's property once they become an adult. It's ruled that a boy under 20 can testify about movable properties but not about land, and it's ruled that a boy can give his late father's property away as a gift, and additionally the other mentioned points. New Mishnah. Now, actually this whole notion that a very sick man can give away his property via an oral declaration, that was actually debated. Some said it's not allowed, acquisitions must be done as applicable. Others disagree and quote an incident wherein a sick mother said to give her daughter her brush, and it was done. The first opinion said that this was wrong. The Gemara cites sources between these opinions, and related, it said that a very sick person can do an act of acquisition on Shabbos to give an item, and this doesn't have anything to do with this dispute. It's just that there's a concern that the person will mentally deteriorate over Shabbos and won't have another chance. New Mishnah. Some say that a sick person can orally transfer the property only on Shabbos, as he's not allowed to otherwise write anything, but it's not allowed any other time, and others disagree and say it's even allowed to be done on weekdays. Another dispute, it's agreed that a person can acquire on behalf of a minor, but it's argued whether a person can acquire items on behalf of an adult. The Gemara quotes sources for this argument, citing different opinions. New Mishnah, a bit of a new topic, back to some points on laws of inheritance. If a house collapsed on a man and his father, or whoever he's inheriting money from, and the son owes somebody money, whether because he borrowed it or through a marriage contract, so it's argued as to who passed away first, the father or the son. The father's heirs claim the son died first, meaning the son never inherited anything, meaning the property cannot go to the creditors, while the creditors claim the father died first, meaning the son inherited, and therefore they would receive the money. So Beis Shammai rules that the father's heirs and the son's creditors just divide the estate, and Beis Hillel rules the father's heirs get to keep the inheritance. The Gemara says, as will be mentioned in a Mishnah in the following chapter, if somebody lends another man money in a document, he can collect on this loan from encumbered properties, which are properties being held by others as collateral. If the loan was taken before witnesses with no document, the lender can only collect from regular unencumbered properties. Now, specifically according to the opinion that holds a person cannot give over an item that doesn't yet exist, it's argued as to what the law is if the borrower specified that he's encumbering future acquired properties and then he ends up acquiring property in the future. So it debates this from a number of different other Mishnayos, one of which is our own, arguing as to whether a borrower can encumber property they doesn't yet own, as similar as seen in our case. It discusses this further and debates what the law is held like. New Mishnah. If a house collapsed simultaneously on a man and his wife, so it's a debate as to who passed away first between the heirs of the wife and the husband. Beis Shammai says the estate is divided. Beis Hillel says the property stay with whoever has it at the moment. So the marriage contract would stay with the husband's heirs, and the woman's personal property would stay with the wife's father. The Gemara says it's actually a debate as to who Beis Hillel holds the woman's jointly owned property stay with. Some say with the husband's heirs, some say with the wife's heirs, and some actually just say to divide them. New Mishnah. If a house collapses on somebody and his mother, it's agreed that the heirs of both divide the estate. Rabbi Akiva says that the property should just stay with whoever has them at the moment, and others disagreed with him, disagreeing with this unanimous ruling. The Gemara clarifies Rabbi Akiva's opinion, saying that the estate stays with the mother's heirs. Additionally, it explains that the sage who criticized Rabbi Akiva was his colleague based on the wording he used. Anyways, related, it was said that if a son sold some of his father's property during his father's lifetime, and then the son passed away, the son's own son can then take back this sold property from the person it was sold to after his grandfather passes. This is said to be a difficult ruling, as apparently there's a bunch of issues with this, and there's a few other opinions suggested, but this is the one it settles on. On this, it's a debate if a grandson can inherit directly from their grandfather, skipping over the passed away father in the middle. It's asked, can a son inherit from his mother after he's passed to pass the inheritance on to his brothers born from his same father? It debates this from a few cases and essentially rules that a dead son cannot inherit from his mother. Some additional cases are spoken on. A man said he's selling the property of Bar Sisson, and there was a property called a property of the Bar Sisson estate, and it was debated if he could then claim this property, as you could argue that the buyer has the burden of proof. However, there is a differing case wherein a man asked another what he's doing in his house, and the resident said he had purchased it and lived there for 3 years, establishing an acquisition, as was spoken on much earlier in the tractate. But the original owner said he had been living in the inner rooms of the property all this while, and he had viewed him only as a guest. So again, it was debated, some saying the burden of proof rests on the man trying to reclaim his house. So it's explained, between these two cases, the latter opinion consistently holds in favor of the individual occupying the property, and the differing opinion has variation, as by the Bar Sisson estate case, he essentially rules that the seller must prove that he's not selling it, but by this case, the current occupant is essentially the equivalent of somebody who's holding a contested deed. So he holds that the occupant needs to bring proof here to receive the house. And that's the end of chapter 9. Chapter 10, the final chapter of Tractate Bava Basra, covers the laws of the different types of legal documents. The first Mishnah says there were basically two types of legal documents. An open document, which is just a standard document, lines of text and signatures at the bottom. And then there was what's called a bound document, wherein between every line of text, the document would then be folded and sewn shut, and the witnesses were written on the back of the document. If an open document, witnesses are signed on the back, or a bound document, witnesses are signed on the front, they'd be invalid. Some actually say a bound document with witnesses on the front is actually valid, as it could just be unbound and made into an open document. Others say it just depends on the local custom. An open document requires 2 witnesses, and a bound document requires 3. If either have less than these, they're invalid. The Gemara cites and discusses a number of scriptural sources for these different types of documents and the variation between them. Some actually suggest that the source for the bound document is that it's a rabbinic enactment, which was done to prevent Kohanim from being able to divorce their wives without a long delay. This would then apply by other types of documents too, besides for just the divorce document, so that way there would be no distinction between them. Now, on a bound document, there's a debate as to where the witnesses' signatures are placed. Some say in between each fold on the front, others say on the back on the opposite side of the text. It's explained, according to this first opinion, that the witnesses aren't just marked at the end of the document. There's no concern of forgery by people trying to add additional text to the bottom of the text, as the words firm and established are written at the very end to mark where the text ends, which can only be written once, and if that area had anything erased, it would invalidate the document. According to the second opinion, that the witnesses sign on the back of the document opposite the text, there's also no concern of forgery, as the signatures are written on the back vertically across the last 2 lines to mark where the text ends, like so. Additionally, there's no concern the bottom line of text could be sliced off, leaving just the father's name, as that wouldn't function as a witness, either possibly as we don't write the word witness after his name, or just that we know the signer's name wasn't his father's name. Others just say that if all the witnesses' full signatures don't start and end on the same line, it would be invalid. It's also said that a scribe must list all of the erasures he's made at the bottom of his document. Some also establish it to be necessary to summarize the essential parts of the document on the last line, as the last line can't be used anyways. It brings proof for this. Now, if a document has a 1.5 line gap between the text and its signatures, it's argued that this is valid, as if there's a 2-line gap, it's invalid, out of concern that people might try to add text. It's explained, if there's a 1.5 line gap, it's still valid. Regarding an invalidation of a 2-line space, there are a few opinions as to exactly how much this is, accounting for specific letters. Some say this invalidation of 2 lines of blank text only applies if it's between the end of the text and the signatures, but if it's in the middle of the text, it'd be fine, so long as the space is inked in. It's a debate if there's concern in the circumstance of a document with its text and signatures all being written on erased parchment. Some actually say 2 blank lines between the text and the witness's signatures invalidates the document, and 1 line between the signatures and the certification invalidates the document. If there's less than this, there's no concern of extra text and witnesses being filled in, as if there's extra witnesses, certification is only checked from the original ones. Anyways, it additionally debates as to whether a document with text and signatures written on erased parchment is valid based on whether there's concern of forgery. Now, one of the opinions in the Mishnah said if a bound document has its witnesses signed on the inside, it's valid, as it could just be unrolled and made into an open document. Others, however, disagree, saying there's additional variance between types of documents, such as the method that they're
dated. A few particular cases on this topic are brought and discussed. One of these instances is where a sage reported another sage as having written a document that was made improperly, and he was told to cease his lashon hara, which is speaking about other people behind their back, or slander. The same occurred when a sage just mentioned a different document had been written by a different sage, which shows that you shouldn't speak about people behind their backs, even excessively about their good qualities, as that could lead to discussion about their faults. Related, it said there are 3 sins which men transgress to some extent every day. These are thoughts of sin, improper concentration within prayer, and avak lashon hara. Avak lashon hara isn't typical slander, as not everybody does that, and instead it refers to neutrally speaking about others in a manner that could be interpreted negatively. The last opinion of the Mishnah said the law with an open or bound document just depends on the locale. Specifically, if the custom is to only write one type of document and the man requested that, and the scribe wrote the wrong type of document, everybody agrees that's invalid. This opinion refers to if the custom is to write either an open or bound document and the scribe makes the opposite of what was specified. The first opinion of the Mishnah would say this is impermissible, while this latter opinion would say he was just giving an example, so it would still be allowed. It quotes sources for these opinions. Anyways, if there are less than the minimum number of signatures for either type of document, it's invalid. It specified this by a bound document, saying only 2 are invalid, as normally 2 witnesses would be sufficient for most other things, but it's argued as to why this was specified by an open document, saying if there's 1 witness, it's invalid, as that's a bit obvious. So some say to teach us that if there's 1 written witness and 1 oral witness, it's insufficient. Others disagree. It additionally debates these principles. New Mishnah: if there was a clause in a document that was self-contradictory, saying somebody borrowed 100 zuz, which is the equivalent of 20 sla'im, the man can only claim 20 sla'im, which are actually worth only 80 zuz. Or if the document said somebody borrowed 100 zuz, which are the equivalent of 30 sla'im, he only has the claim of 100 zuz. If the document says he's borrowing silver zuzim, which are, and then the following number is erased, the claim is no less than 2 zuz. If it says silver sla'im, which are, and the following number is erased, the claim is no less than 2 sla'im. If it says darkanos, which is the type of gold coin, which are, and the following number is erased, the claim is not less than 2 darkanais. If in the upper part of the document the specified amount was 100 zuz, and in the lower part of the document it says 200 zuz, or vice versa, it goes according to what's written in the lower portion. The purpose of the upper portion is just in case parts of the lower portion become erased. The Gemara brings some particular cases. If the document just said silver, it's no less than a single silver dinar. If it said silver, dinars, or dinars, silver, the claim is no less than 2 silver dinars. If it said silver in dinars, he has a claim of no less than 2 golden dinars value in silver. It additionally discusses these definitions, and it further qualifies the definition of particular vague coin phrases within a document and what they reference at a minimum. Anyways, it was said that the point of the upper portion of a document is for if the lower portion has some letters erased. Some say this only applies to the erasure of a single letter, but it can be adjusted based on what's written in the upper portion. 2 letters are an issue, as then there could be a case where a name with 3 letters is written in the bottom portion, and 2 letters are missing, so then majority of the name will be based on the upper portion. There are unresolved points on deriving particular orders, and there are also additional points on practices to avoid forgery. For instance, if somebody's writing a sample of his signature, he should do so at the very top of a document to prevent people from finding the signature and just filling in text above his signature. Additionally, if a number from 3 to 10 is being written in a document, it should not be written at the end of a line, in case somebody finds the document and tries to add a bunch of extra zeros or something. And if he does write this number at the end of the line, he should re-specify the number later on in the document in the middle of a line. A bunch of incidents where things along these lines occurred are listed. New Mishnah: it's permitted to write a divorce document for a man even if his wife is not present. A marriage contract, redemption, receipt can be written for a woman even if the husband is not present, so long as they're recognized. The husband would pay the scribe's fees for these documents. A loan document can be written for a borrower even though the lender is there, but it cannot be written for the lender without the borrower being there, and the borrower needs to pay the scribe. A sales document can be written for a seller without the buyer being there, although a buyer cannot have a document written without the seller being there. The buyer pays the scribe. A betrothal or marriage document needs to be written with the knowledge of both parties, and the groom pays the fee. Similarly, sharecropping or tenant farming documents must be written with the knowledge of both parties, and the tenant pays the fee. Beirurin documents, which will be explained, or court judgments must be written with the knowledge of both parties, and the fee is split. Others say 2 documents are written for both parties here. The Gemara says, regarding the point that a divorce document or a marriage contract receipt can be written so long as the husband or wife are recognized. Some define this as recognizing the husband's name by the divorce document and the wife's name by the marriage contract receipt. Others disagree and say due to concerns of forgery, both the husband and wife in both cases must be recognized. Incidents are cited, and it discusses the remaining points. The necessity for specifying that a borrower needs to pay the scribe is to show that that would apply even in a situation where the money was borrowed for business and the profit is being split with the lender. The specification that a buyer pays the scribal fee is to show that this applies even when the seller is only selling his field as it's of very poor quality. The point that a groom pays the scribal fee is to show this applies even if the groom is a very sought-after individual, such as a rabbinical student. The point that a tenant pays the scrabble fee is specified to show it applies even if the land is being left fallow for the initial period. Anyways, it's a debate as to what a Beirut document even is. Some say a document recording litigant arguments, others say it's the document recording judge selection. It's also argued why this latter opinion says in a court ruling there would be documents given to both parties. New Mishnah, if somebody repaid part of his debt and gave his loan document to a third party and then told the third party that if he doesn't finish repaying the loan before a certain date, the document should be returned to the lender, and this date arrived, it's a debate as to whether this document should actually be returned. The Gemara explains this debate as to whether an agreement made without intent to fulfill, called an asmachta, is considered to be a binding agreement, and it rules it is not. New Mishnah, if somebody's loan document was accidentally erased, he should bring his witnesses to court to write a document of validation which states that the prior document was erased, the date it was written, and who signed it. The Gemara additionally clarifies the text of this document and its certification. It's also said a torn document, which is done intentionally, is done by the court. Some say by tearing through the witnesses, the date, the text body, and others just say an X-shaped tear is considered to be invalid. If it's just ordinarily ripped, it's valid. If the document is erased or stained, if it's still legible, it's valid. Additional cases are quoted, and it's also said if somebody said he lost his loan document, even if witnesses testify to having written it, he doesn't receive a new one. By a sale document, though, he would receive a new one, although not a guarantee. Others disagree, and it debates as to why the guarantee would be omitted by a sale document. This is discussed. Now, it's said that a replacement deed by a sale document does not include the guarantee. It clarifies just how the sale document is written and some suggestions as to the text that it should contain. There are further points. Also, it's said by some, if somebody gives a gift to another person and the recipient returned the gift document, the actual gift would also be returned. Some clarify this to be as the gift was given so long as he keeps the document, and others disagree as the document could just then get lost or stolen. So they suggest he holds this as this opinion states that letters can be acquired via the acquisition form of handing over. Similarly, by the same logic, there's a debate. If somebody is acquiring property via a deed and an acquisition, as to which of these would be used. Again, this is disputed based on whether a person can acquire a letter via a handing over acquisition, and there are additional interpretations of this dispute. It's alternatively suggested that the debate in this case is over whether a person is required to corroborate a superfluous claim, and it's still debated as to who the law accords with. New Mishnah, if somebody repaid part of his debt, Rabbi Yehuda says he should get a new debt document written up with the adjusted amounts. Rabbi Yossi says he should just write a receipt. Rabbi Yehuda said then there's a concern the man's receipt could get lost or destroyed. And Rabbi Yossi said his way is more fair to the lender as it pressures the borrower to return the debt. The Gemara says there's actually a third opinion, which is that the court tears up the original document and writes a new one with the first one's date. It additionally discusses these opinions. Also, it's said by a document dated on Shabbos or Yom Kippur when you're not allowed to write. Some say it's valid as we assume that the document was post-dated. Others say it's invalid. Anyways, according to Rabbi Yossi, who said we allow a lender to write a receipt for a partially paid debt, some clarify this to only be for a partially paid debt and not for a full debt. And this is debated and largely refuted. Anyways, broadly, post-dated documents are valid and predated documents are invalid. Some clarify this to only apply by loan documents, but by sale documents, even post-dated documents would be invalid as it could cause issues with the sale. It is clarified post-dated documents are written, but they just need to have mentioned within that they were actually post-dated. Later, it was said to just write the original date in the receipt, or to just write no date in the receipt to prevent any potential fraud, and it discusses some additional cases. New Mishnah. If there were two brothers, one rich and one poor, and their father passed, leaving them a bathhouse or an olive press, if it was for renting, the building should continue to be rented and the profits would be divided equally. If the bathhouse or olive press were made for personal use, the rich brother can tell the poor one to just personally use the olive press or otherwise and make income. Anyways, back to documents. If there were two men in the same town and both had the exact same name, say Yosef ben Shimon, for instance, they cannot produce a loan document against each other, and people cannot produce loan documents against them. If a document is found saying Yosef ben Shimon paid his debt, both of their debts are treated as paid. To avoid this issue, in any document, they would need to add a third generation name to the document. If they had the same name there too, they should mention some physical identifying feature, and if they were identical, they should write if one of them was a Cohen. The Gemara states case, a document was found which said that a person had borrowed a document from you without specifying a name. It was said this document was useless to prove anything as it could refer to literally anybody. Others disagreed and said that the words "from you" imply that it belongs to whoever it was found with, that they own the document. And it debates between these opinions from some cases. It is agreed that there's no concern that the document was dropped by somebody and was picked up by another man with the exact same name. Related, it is said that letters can be acquired via an acquisition of handing over, although it is then a debate if proof of this must be brought. Anyways, regarding a document with a name that's held by more than one person in the town, some actually debate the Mishnah, saying loan documents between or about these people are actually permitted, as they'd hold a loan document cannot be written for a borrower without the lender being present, so there would be no concern of forgery if that's the case. It also qualifies the remaining cases. New Mishnah, if somebody says to his son as he's dying that he has a bunch of loan documents and one of them was paid by the borrower, but he's not sure which, all of them are assumed to be paid. If 2 loan documents from a single borrower were found in the pile, the larger loan is considered to be paid and the smaller one is considered to be unpaid. The Gemara says a point. If a lender says to a borrower that the loan document between them is paid, but he's holding 2 loan documents, then the larger amount is assumed to be paid. If, however, the lender said that the debt between them is paid, all of the documents are assumed to be paid. This applies by loan documents, as the lender has the burden of proof, unlike by laws of sale. New Mishnah, if somebody lends money to another on the basis of a guarantor, somebody who guarantees a lender that he'll pay the loan if the borrower cannot, the lender cannot collect from the guarantor first, as will be explained, unless this was specified at the time of the loan. The lender can collect from either of them whenever he wants. Some say if the borrower has land property when the due date comes, the lender cannot collect from the guarantor first in either case. Similarly, it's said if somebody is a guarantor towards a woman for her marriage contract and her husband divorced her, the husband needs to take a vow to not have her benefit from him, because otherwise then they could just have the guarantor pay the marriage contract and then they could just remarry. The Gemara explains the reason why a guarantor for a loan cannot be collected from first, which is that he could claim he didn't agree to repay the loan, he only agreed to have somebody be available to be responsible for the loan. Others disagree and explain logic just to be as stated, that the guarantor cannot be collected from first. It also cites a number of scriptural sources for these principles of a guarantor, and it's also a debate as to whether becoming a guarantor is even considered to be a binding obligation. The remaining cases are discussed. It does mention that there's actually a stricter status of a guarantor called a kablan guarantor, wherein a guarantor personally receives a loan from a lender and gives it to the borrower. He's said to be as responsible as the lender himself, and it discusses the particular words and phrases a person can say that would make him obligated towards that status. Additional incidents are cited. For example, it's ruled that if a borrower was placed under a ban by a court and he died in that state, the guarantor can collect from his orphans. Others disagree with this view, and it's discussed, and it cites and debates some additional particular incidents. Additionally, it said, if a person consecrated all of his property to the temple and then said that an amount of money he has actually belongs to somebody else, he's believed, as we presume people don't try to commit fraud against the temple treasury. Evidently, this is argued on from some additional cases. Anyways, it said if a seriously sick person admitted to owing some money, it's a debate as to whether he needs to assign the people listening to him as witnesses or whether he needs to have them write this in a document. This is based on whether or not we assume a dying man to make jokes, and it said we do not, hence the designation of witnesses is just not necessary. New Mishnah, final Mishnah of the Tractate. If somebody lends money to another and records this in a document, the debt can be collected from encumbered properties. Encumbered properties are essentially just properties being held as collateral. If there's no document but there are witnesses, he can only take it from unencumbered property. If the lender has a loan document but it's not in his own handwriting, he can only collect from unencumbered properties. Similarly, if the guarantor's pledge is only written after the signatures on the document, it can only be collected from unencumbered properties. This is, as in such a scenario, the guarantee has no legal force, as it was offered only after the money was pledged, as seen in a related example. Also, it was said if somebody wants to become wise, they should study monetary law, as there is no greater branch of Torah. And particularly, it should be studied from the sage Reb Shimon ben Nanas, who gave this latter ruling. The Gemara says, biblically, whether a loan was written on a document or given orally, it should be collected from encumbered properties. It was rabbinically instituted to not be allowed by oral loans, as such a loan is not public knowledge and people might make a mistaken purchase on the loaned property. Others disagree and say biblically both written or oral loans cannot be collected from encumbered properties, and it was rabbinically allowed to collect encumbered properties from a written loan to allow prospective buyers who are aware of the loan as it's publicly written down. It additionally disputes the principle of this debate, which is essentially as to whether the concept of encumbrance is biblical or not. Related, it's ruled that by an oral loan it can be collected from the heirs, but not from the buyers, again, as it's not publicized. Anyways, we said if somebody produces a loan document, but it's not in his handwriting, he can only collect from unencumbered properties. It's a debate as to what the status is if his handwriting was then authenticated in court. It was also said if the guarantor wrote his name after the signatures, it can only be collected from unencumbered property. It explains according to some, there's variation. This is where it writes, and this man's name is a guarantor. If it was written before the signatures, but just said, this man's name is a guarantor, there would still be no collection from unencumbered properties. Others disagree and say in either case collection is only allowed from unencumbered properties, and this is disputed further. Anyways, it is said that we actually do rule, unlike Bar Nanas, that a guarantee pledged after a loan is granted still obligates the guarantor, and it debates the remaining points. It's also ruled that if somebody consented to become a guarantor to save somebody's life, and he did formal acquisition to legitimize this, he's still obligated to keep to his pledge. It said that this implies that typically a guarantor does not require an acquisition to make a pledge binding, although others dispute this. In the end, it's held a guarantor who commits himself at the time the money is lent does not require a formal acquisition, but if he committed after the money was lent, he does need to do a formal acquisition, while a guarantor of the court never needs to perform a formal acquisition, as it's sufficient that he's trusted by the court. And that's the end of chapter 10 and the entire Tractate Bava Basra. Alright, that was a lot of information, so here's a rough summary of a lot of the practical takeaways from this tractate. If property is shared between two people, they both have rights to this property and what's done with it. This includes things like if one person wants to build certain structures on the property that can damage the other man's portion, the other has the rights to prevent him, or in many circumstances both sides can agree and be made to split the cost for a wall across the dividing line. The details of these laws are very particular and vary case by case. When an item is sold, depending on the item, there's particularities as to what the sale includes. For instance, if someone purchases a house, there are certain portions of the house that are always included in the sale and others which are excluded. The same goes for the sale of just about every type of item ever, and are specified within this tractate. There's an obligation to be honest in business dealings. What's discussed here is to have properly measured weights and scales to make certain you never cheat or overcharge a customer. Naturally, the same applies nowadays in all of the ways business is done. When a person passes away, their heirs inherit their estate. There's a particular order to this inheritance between all family members, from children to spouses to siblings and further. Typically, a firstborn inherits a double portion. Again, the laws of this are very particular and vary case by case. And that's about everything. Thank you so much for watching.